A killer beginning. The coffee house was in chaos. A girl with dyed red hair and a nose ring worked the register, while a teenage boy with a fresh case of acne ran back and forth from the espresso machines to the counter. The girl wore a smile, but it didn't hide the underlying stress she was likely experiencing. The pair of workers were barely treading water. The line of customers backed up to the front door, and the drive-through wrapped around the building and into the street. Murmurs, laughter, and the chimes of numerous phone notifications filled the crowded shop. The noise fueled the headache scratching at the surface of Megan Hall's skull. She needed her caffeine. Megan checked the time on her phone, growing impatient. She had been in line for almost 20 minutes, and it was already 8:17. Her exam started in less than 15 minutes. She would have bailed after seeing the line, but she wasn't about to take her statistics final without a mocha latte first. No caffeine guaranteed a poor grade. The lobby grew uncomfortably warm with so many bodies packed so tightly, and the morning sun beaming in through the windows did little to help the situation. Megan wished she would have woken up early enough to have taken a shower, but after a late night she let herself sleep in. So today was a beanie day. The long-sleeve button-up and tights weren't helping either. Megan decided that this was her punishment for waiting to schedule the final until last minute, leaving her with a Saturday appointment. As miserable as she was at the moment, it could have been worse. Megan was happy that the aroma of coffee overpowered the other smells that could fill the room instead. For instance, the guy in front of her looked particularly raunchy. He was big, a bodybuilder type, maybe in his 30s, wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt with dark sweat stains ringing his armpits and back. Sweat beaded on the ends of his matted hair. He either had the workout of his life, or he was dying. Megan figured she didn't want to be downwind of him either way. "Let's go," a man cried near the front of the line. "Some of us have actual jobs to get to. How hard can it be to make a cup of coffee? The machine does it for you." Megan rolled her eyes at the comment, though she too was in a hurry. The red-haired girl behind the counter gave the man a sharp look. "Dude, chill. We're doing the best we can. We're a little short-staffed today." The acne-ridden boy was clearly feeling the pressure. He ran back toward the register, a cup in each hand, neither of which had secure lids. His hip caught on the counter, and both coffees spilled over his hands and onto the floor. The scalding liquid made him cry out, and he dropped what was left. A chorus of moans and curses filled the storefront. Megan couldn't help but feel the same way. She was already pushing past the time she needed to make it into class, given there was no traffic on the way. "Nice one," a boy yelled from behind Megan. The comment brought a few snickers from the line. The boy turned bright red, probably both from the pain and the embarrassment. The red-haired girl bent down, picking up the 2 cups, and said something to the boy. Megan couldn't make it out, but the girl probably told him to go wash up or get a medical kit, because he soon disappeared into the back. "Look," said the man who had first issued a complaint. "I'll give you $50 to just get me my coffee right now. That should be enough money for a fresh piece of metal to stick in your face. What do you say?" Megan leaned over to catch sight of the man. He looked like someone's dad. He wore a bright blue polo with black dress pants and a phone clipped to his belt. His dark brown hair was full and combed to the side. He didn't dress well enough to look like someone with a superiority complex, but then again, assholes come in all shapes and sizes. "I'd say to get bent, dude," the red-haired girl said. "Go get your coffee somewhere else." About that time, the sweaty weightlifter in front of Megan fell to the ground. He didn't even try to catch himself. He just dropped straight down, his body slapping on the tile floor. Megan jumped in surprise and backed away as an older woman rushed to his side. "Jesus Christ," the asshole dad said. "This place is a shit show. Have fun with that," he added, pointing at the weightlifter on the floor. "I'm going across the street." The girl behind the counter ignored him and leaned over, trying to see what the commotion was. "Is he okay?" she asked. An older woman wearing a pink breast cancer awareness shirt had her fingers at the big man's wrist. Her eyes went wide as she shook her head. "You need to call for an ambulance. I can't find a pulse." The red-haired girl froze in place. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing coherent followed. "Now," the woman in pink yelled. The barista shook herself out of her stupor and quickly disappeared into the back, leaving no one at the register. A small circle formed around the man on the floor, and Megan stayed back watching intently. Her final be damned. It's not like she didn't have an excellent reason to get out of it at this point. "Ridiculous," the asshole dad muttered as he skirted his way through the crowd. That's when the big man opened his eyes and began to move. "Oh, thank God," the older woman said as the sound of amazement went through the small circle of onlookers. "Are you okay?" Then the man did something unexpected. He grabbed a hold of the woman's arm and then took a huge bite. When he tilted his head back, he revealed a sizable chunk of raw, sinewy muscle clenched between his teeth. The woman screamed as she tried to pull away, but the man didn't let go of her. A large crimson pool formed on the floor between them, as blood spurted from the woman's open wound. The rest of the crowd broke into a panic. Most people fled for the doors screaming, but a few others courageously started kicking at the man, trying to get him off of her. The asshole dad pushed past Megan, throwing her to the ground. Her head bounced off of the hard tile floor, blurring her vision as her eyes filled with tears. She could feel people tripping and stepping on her, heading for the door. Fear gripping her, she tried to get to her hands and knees, but someone's knee collided with her ribs, and the pain sent her crashing back down. Thankfully, someone grabbed a hold of her hand, trying to help her up. She kicked her feet, trying to use the support to stand up, but whoever had grabbed her pulled her back down. They pulled her closer to where the carnage was happening, instead of helping her escape. When Megan looked behind her, it was the weightlifter that had a hold of her. He was no longer concerned about the older woman, who had managed to free herself and was now being rushed out of the door. Megan tried to pull her arm free, but the man was incredibly strong. "Please let me go," she whimpered. Half of her hand found his mouth, and then pain lanced through her arm as his teeth clamped down. She heard herself screaming, but it felt so distant, like none of it was even real. She felt like she was floating above the entire scene, watching herself endure the horrific act of being eaten alive. Everything seemed so small from up there. The need for coffee, the test, none of it really mattered. She heard a snap and more pain came. Her screams were still the muted cries of someone else in her ears. A wet chewing sound rose above the screams. The smell of coffee still filled the air, though now there was a metallic undertone. Soon the pain receded completely, and Megan felt nothing as she drifted into darkness. Chapter 2. Tea time at Grandma's house. Margaret McDaniel sat a plate down with a shaking hand. Freshly baked whole wheat bread, turkey sliced at Moretti's meat market, lettuce and tomato from the neighbor's garden, a little mayonnaise and a dash of love. It was her granddaughter's favorite. Margaret always made it for her when she came to visit. Her granddaughter, Emma, sat stooped in a wicker chair with a smile on her face. She was such a pretty thing. Margaret still remembered seeing her for the first time. She was all hair and flailing purple hands. Now she was nearly 16 years old. As a baby, Emma had dark brown hair, but as she grew older, her hair turned blonde. That was a common trait with all the girls in her family. No matter if their hair was brown or bright red when they were babies, it eventually took on a golden hue. Emma also shared Margaret's little button nose and gray eyes. She was a tiny thing too. Margaret could remember when she had been that size, but now that she was catching up to 80, she had put on a little weight. "Thanks, Nana," Emma said. "You always make the best sandwiches." "You're welcome, sweetie," Margaret said. A smile reached her eyes as Emma took a big bite of the sandwich. She may have been petite, but she still had the appetite of a grown man. Margaret didn't mind. If it kept Emma coming back to visit, she would make her sandwiches every day. So, you were telling me about the car you wanted. What was it again? Margaret asked, sitting down across the kitchen table. She hadn't made herself anything to eat, but she did have a cup of hot tea on a saucer. The new Subaru Outback, Emma said over a mouthful of food. A silver one. She paused, tilting her head to the side like a confused puppy. Or maybe blue. I guess I don't really care about the color. I'd be happy just to get one. It's the perfect car. What did your parents say when you asked about it? Margaret pulled her tea closer to her. The warmth brought comfort to her aching hands. Mom said they couldn't afford it. And your father? Margaret asked over her tea with an eyebrow raised. Emma wrinkled her nose. He said that there was no way he was buying me a brand new car to wreck. He's always been a positive one, Margaret said, biting back more. Her son-in-law had always been, in a lack of a better word, a bastard. He treated her daughter like garbage. He was a terrible husband, and in Margaret's opinion a poor father too. Yeah, I get it, I guess, Emma said before taking another man-sized bite. I thought maybe I had a shot for my birthday this year since I've been dropping hints for 6 months now. I think Mom wants to hand me down the cruise though. Emma, always the pragmatic one. It was strange that she had been an only child, and yet lacked the self-entitlement Margaret saw so frequently in other children. Maybe it was that Emma's parents were too selfish to spoil her. It's not that they didn't have money. In fact, that was the only thing her son-in-law had been good for, but they liked to put their own needs over that of Emma's. Regardless, Margaret liked to think Emma just won the gene lottery and was more like herself than that of her mother or father. She always heard great genetics skip a generation. Well, that's a nice car too. It's okay, I guess. The only problem is that Dad just bought the Audi, so Mom will probably have to hold on to the cruise for a year or two. Emma looked up from her sandwich. I'll probably be out of school by the time I get a car, she said like she had just considered the possibility. Emma's parents may not have spoiled her, but that's where Margaret came in. Emma was her only granddaughter. Margaret, unfortunately, had only been able to conceive Patricia, her daughter and Emma's mother. That had been hard on her husband Robert, God rest his soul, but he had never expressed it. He came from an extensive family, and had always wanted a gaggle of children running around. They often talked about it in their early years, but after years of trying those talks became less frequent. The family used to prod the couple asking when they could expect little McDaniels running around, and they would laugh off the questions. After about a decade of trying, the questions and jokes ceased altogether. Margaret had been a wreck back then, but Robert had always been supportive. He never displayed his disappointment, though his eyes gave him away from time to time. The two had all but given up by the time Patricia came along. It was a hard pregnancy, but it didn't matter. Patricia had been a miracle. And Patricia had brought her Emma. Such a gift, and Patricia didn't even recognize it. If Emma wanted a car, Margaret would make sure she got one. Did you apply at Midtown Grocery like I suggested? I know the manager, he's a nice boy. I did, Emma started, but she had pulled out her phone and the screen stole her attention. After a few quick taps of her fingertips, the screen went dark again. And? Well, he was willing to hire me, but they didn't need much help. It's okay, just getting in the door is a start. They'll give you more hours when they need you. Besides, you're in school anyway. Nana, I didn't take it, Emma said with a wince. Didn't take it? But why not, dear? Emma took a deep breath. This was obviously something she had been dreading, discussing with Margaret. They would only pay me minimum wage to stock the shelves. And I know, you have to start somewhere, but it's not what I want to do. I don't want to end up like my mom and dad. I'm sure they started out that same way, just a starter job while they were in high school, then a service job when they went off to college, and after graduation they settled into a position they hated, but the money was okay, and they had bills and social lives to fund. I don't want that. I've seen what it does. Margaret could hardly blame her. Things had definitely changed since she had been that age. When she graduated high school, she married Robert and supported him while he went off to work. In those first few years when money was tight, she would sneak off to clean houses for grocery money. Robert never knew. He had always been so adamant that she shouldn't have to work. If he had found out they weren't cutting it on his income alone, he would have been ashamed. Margaret had allowed herself that secret, for his sake at the least. And to Robert's credit, he escalated the management ladder quickly so her secret could remain hidden. But sweetie, everyone needs money. I know it's not ideal, but what about that car you're wanting so badly? If you could make a little on your own, you wouldn't have to wait for your parents. I know, and that's why I started working. But now I work for myself, not for other people. Emma smiled, but it was an unsure smile. Whatever she was at, it was important that Margaret accepts. Oh. How so? Margaret asked. Do you remember when we used to stay up late when I was little, just crocheting? The memories filled Margaret with joy. Of course, she remembered. Emma had been so young then. She struggled with even the simplest parts of crochet. It took her a week to grasp the concept of a slipknot, but once she did, she took off like a rocket, excelling at pattern after pattern. How could I forget? She said with a smile. Well, I've been making my own designs like these, she said, pulling up her sleeves. Black crossed threads of yarn formed fingerless gloves, and the material stretched almost up to her elbow. It was quite fashionable and looked warm. A lot of people at school loved them, and asked me to make them some. At first I just had them buy the yarn, and I made it for them because I loved to do it anyway, but then my art teacher insisted on paying me. She gave me $20 for a pair. That's marvelous, dear. You were always so resourceful. Thanks, Nana, Emma said, her smile growing. I put some of my work on Etsy a few weeks ago too. I had more orders than I expected I would. I even had to spend a few school nights up just to get them done. What's an Etsy? Oh right, Emma said. It's an online marketplace for people to sell their crafts. You know, kind of like your craft shows you always go to, but over the internet. Emma's phone vibrated on the table and lit up. She picked it back up with haste, pulling it into her lap, and her fingers danced across the screen once more. Margaret couldn't help but be annoyed by the intrusive device. Her time with Emma was important to her, and she didn't enjoy having competition. Emma usually never pulled her phone out during her visits, but something had her attention today. Margaret wouldn't be surprised if it were a boy. That's lovely, Margaret said. And here I thought you kids just used that thing to send each other dirty pictures. Nana, how do you know about that kind of stuff? Emma said, growing red. Margaret smiled at the reaction. So it had been a boy. What? Margaret said. That's what I would have done when I was your age. I would have loved to have had the internet and cellular phones around when I was young and pretty. Do you know how hard it was to sneak around with your grandfather in high school? Parents were a little more watchful of young girls back then. Having some dirty pictures to keep your grandfather occupied would have made things easier. Nana, stop. I don't want to picture that. Emma said, still glowing like a fire engine. Don't be such a prude, Margaret said, chuckling. You'll see one day. Emma still looked mortified, but she took another bite of her sandwich. She was probably more embarrassed about being caught than anything. Back to the car. Margaret started, deciding to give Emma a break. If Emma wanted to talk about boys, she would come to Margaret eventually. If you can come up with a small sum for a down payment, I'll front the rest of the bill. Seriously? Emma said with too much food in her mouth. Of course, dear. You're a good girl, and that's what grandmas are for, spoiling their grandchildren. Or grandchild in her case. Nana, I couldn't let you do that. That's so much money. Yes, you can, and you will. But first, you'll need to show me you're serious. Get me at least $500, and we'll get you that car. You'll have to work for it. Oh my God, Emma started to squeal. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Shush. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Nana. You are the best. Emma was practically jumping up and down at the offer. Yes. This was something Margaret missed about being a mother, being needed. Margaret smiled and took another sip of tea as a loud thump sounded at the front door. The thump startled Margaret. She spilled some of her tea, scalding her hand. Emma also jerked in surprise. For a moment both Margaret and Emma sat perplexed, staring at the door. It had been so loud. It was like someone took a running leap into it. My, that was quite aggressive, Margaret finally added, her eyes still locked on the front door. Margaret had not been expecting company. In fact, Emma stopping by had been a surprise. She would have figured the girl had better things to do on a Saturday afternoon, but she had her father drop her off. Emma looked like a deer ready to bolt. She could sense something was amiss as well. I'm sure it's fine, dear. I'll go see who it is. As Margaret stood, another thump sounded just as violent as the first. Though this thump was followed by a gurgling sound and a moan. Margaret jumped and strained her less than perfect hearing, trying to identify what that sound could be. It had been so strange. It reminded her of a feral animal, but that made little sense. They were in the middle of a neighborhood. Another thump. This one sounded like a fist pounding on the bottom of the door. And was it Margaret's imagination, or did she hear screaming as well? It was almost unnoticeable. Surely she was wrong. Still, something primal told Margaret not to open that door. Chapter 3. Riding shotgun. Stay here, dear, Margaret said, masking the fear in her voice. Nana, where are you going? Emma said, wide-eyed. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she did not reach for it. I just need to grab something from my closet. I'll be right back. Do not open that door. Do you hear me? Margaret was finding it difficult to hide her concern. Something strange was happening, she could sense that much, and she did not want Emma to try anything on her own. Emma nodded, still transfixed on the door. The bumping at the door had grown more frequent, and a light scratching started. Something was pawing at the door, perhaps a rabid animal? Margaret passed through the kitchen and living room barrier into a dark hallway. Her craft room was on her left, and she peeked through the open door. It had a small TV propped on countless folds of cloth and old newspapers. Her rocking chair sat idly surrounded by baskets of yarn. It was her sanctuary in these lonely days. Continuing on, she crossed over to her bedroom on the right. The comforting scent of eucalyptus greeted her upon entry. It had been some time since Robert had passed. The room used to smell like him. She missed it. Once his smell no longer lingered, she had burned eucalyptus candles to relieve the anxiety of being alone. It wasn't a cure-all, but it helped some. Sliding an old wooden door, she pushed her way into a walk-in closet. She pulled the cord to turn on a single light bulb, shedding light in the boxed-in room. Clothes hung on all three sides, while boxes sat atop shelves. Most of the clothes were Margaret's, but some were Robert's. She could not bring herself to get rid of them. Unlike the room itself, some of these still held his scent. She fingered through his old jackets, stopping on an old tan corduroy one. She trailed her fingertips up and down the material, letting the ridges tickle memories into her fingertips. She remembered the day they had bought it. It had been for Robert's first real interview. He had been so nervous then. He was so young, so inexperienced, and yet, he had always done what was necessary. Margaret pushed past the jackets and grabbed for something long and heavy, tilted against the wall. She felt blindly until cold metal bit into her hands. The metal belonged to a 12-gauge Philadelphia Fox double-barrel shotgun. It had been a wedding gift from her father to Robert. I protected her for 18 years, and now I am trusting you to take the reins. "Don't disappoint me, son." That was what the note had said on the paper tag. The tag no longer hung on the gun, but Margaret still remembered the words. It was funny how she couldn't remember if she had taken her pills that morning, but could still remember even the smallest things from her younger days. Next to where the gun had stood laid an old coffee tin. It was where Robert had kept his shells. Margaret grabbed 2 shells from the tin, returned the lid, and tucked the container under her arm as she pushed a shell into each barrel. The thumping never stopped. If anything, the frequency increased. And she hadn't been sure of the screams before, but now it was growing clear something was happening out there. Her mind turned back to the thought of a wild animal. Bears weren't common in this area, but maybe it was an enormous dog or wild cat of some kind. Whatever it was, Margaret wasn't opening that door without a little protection. With the tin still tucked under one arm and the shotgun aiming at the floor, Margaret shuffled out of her room. When she reached the kitchen, Emma was no longer in her chair. Instead, she had made her way into the living room, angling toward the front window veiled by thick yellow curtains. Carrying the shotgun and tin together was difficult, and made Margaret's gait awkward, so she dropped the coffee can on the kitchen table. The thud of metal and rattling of shells seemed loud in the small home. Emma's gaze went from the tin to the shotgun cradled in Margaret's arms. Her eyes went wide at the sight. "Nana, what are you doing? Where did you get a gun?" "It was your grandfather's." "Don't worry, I know how to shoot it. Your grandfather taught me back when we lived in the country." "Nana, that was before I was born," Emma said, still concerned. "Hush. Trust in your grandmother." Emma opened her mouth, probably to object further, but a loud scream erupted in Margaret's backyard. It was a feminine scream, a familiar cry at that. It sounded like it may have come from Margaret's neighbor, Dorothy. The hair on Margaret's neck stood at full attention. The shrieks were chilling. Also chilling was that the pounding on the front door ceased at the screams. "Stay put," Margaret said in a firm tone as she headed toward the kitchen window. Pulling back the curtains, Margaret witnessed something she could not fathom. The screaming had in fact been coming from her neighbor. Dorothy was sprawled out in an army crawl, wailing in pain. She pulled and clawed on elbows and knees while a strange-looking man lay on top of her. Even stranger was that he buried his face into the back of her thigh. There was something wrong with the man, he looked ill. Margaret could not see his face, but his hair was patchy. He was shirtless and his back was pallid with open sores splotched about like he was a leper. Gore covered his body all the way down to his shredded denim jeans. Margaret couldn't make out any noticeable wounds on the man. It was as if the blood was not his own. Whoever this horrifying man was, he was attacking Dorothy and Margaret needed to do something. She could not just gawk, she had to help her. As soon as the thought crossed her mind, the man lifted his head from her neighbor's leg. His teeth were clenched and he jerked his head, ripping a piece of sinewy flesh from the leg. Blood dribbled from the chunk of meat down his chin. More cries of pain followed from Dorothy. "God have mercy," Margaret cried, bringing a free hand to her gaping mouth. She tried to tell herself she wasn't seeing what was playing out before her, but there was no denying it. That man was eating Dorothy. "What?" Emma blurted. "What is it?" She rushed toward the window, but Margaret pushed her back. "Don't," Margaret yelled. "Listen to me, dear. I need you to pay attention. Call 911 and tell them there is an attack in progress." "An attack?" Emma asked, eyes wide. "What does that mean? What kind of attack?" "Just listen to what I say, child. Call for help. In the meantime, I will do what I can." "You're going out there?" Emma asked incredulously. "I have to. Do not open this door for anyone unless I say. Do you hear me?" "Yes, I understand," Emma said, digging her cell phone out of her pocket. "Please be careful, Nana." Margaret placed a loving hand on Emma's face and forced a reassuring smile. Then she turned toward the walkout door farther down the kitchen. One hand on her shotgun and one hand on the sliding glass door, she paused. Someone else was racing toward the attack in her backyard. No. Not a someone, more of a something. The creature appeared sickly like the attacker in her backyard, and walked bipedally like a human, but it had a large hunch on its back, causing it to lean forward. It used one arm to support the weight of the hunch, making its run similar to that of a gorilla. Its hands were abnormally large, bigger than any man's. They looked to be the size of tennis rackets, complete with fingers the size of bananas. Its jaw was unhinged, and it sloshed about as it ran toward Dorothy. Shock overtook Margaret. She had seen nothing like the creature, even in fiction. She could only watch in horror, as the newcomer ripped into the top half of Dorothy. Pink mist sprayed into the air as he barreled on top of her. His enormous fists pulled and ripped into her neighbor's flesh, and he shoved the handfuls of Dorothy into his mangled maw. Dorothy's screaming ceased. "No one is answering," Emma cried out. "What's happening out there?" Margaret turned to face her granddaughter. Emma looked to be near tears. Margaret couldn't blame her, though she felt a sense of detachment after witnessing her neighbor being eaten alive by those things. "I don't think anyone will answer, dear. We are more than likely on our own." "What?" Emma asked. Instead of answering, Margaret brushed past her and grabbed a fistful of shells out of the tin. If any of those things got inside, she wasn't sure that the 2 shells she had loaded would take them down. She would not let them get anywhere near Emma. A loud scream let out next to Margaret. The sound caused Margaret to jump. When she turned around, she saw that Emma had made her way to the walkout doors that led to the backyard. Her eyes were locked in horror at the view just past the thin pane of glass. Emma must have realized her mistake because almost instantly, she slapped both hands over her mouth. Margaret rushed to her side. With luck, the monsters would be too focused on Dorothy to hear her granddaughter scream. But as she feared, the creatures turned their attention away from their meal and focused on Emma. They seemed confused by the glass barrier, but still they stumbled upright, eyes locked on the door. The front door may have been able to hold back these things, but that was solid oak. A glass door was another story. Emma backed away, and Margaret pushed her way in between her granddaughter and the glass doors, keeping the creatures outside. Her pants didn't have pockets, so she maintained a grip of loose shells while handling the shotgun. Margaret's line of sight was partially blocked. The sliding doors lead out onto a small patio with a covered wooden swing, surrounded by numerous potted flowers. The smaller man, covered in sores, was quicker to his feet and had nearly reached the glass doors. The gorilla-sized creature was not far behind, though his path would lead him directly into the wooden swing. Margaret held her breath and watched the large lumbering beast as the smaller one inched closer to the glass panes. If she were lucky, the big oaf would walk right into the swing. The obstacle would hopefully give her enough time to take care of the smaller man-like creature and reload if needed. And sure enough, the bigger of the two did not avert its path to miss the swing. Instead, he continued through it as though it weren't there. It became caught between the cover and swing, tripping him and knocking him off his feet. As he fell forward, the swing swung, eventually pulling him farther back, before collapsing underneath the behemoth's weight. Feeling this was her best opportunity, Margaret rushed to the door, sliding it open far enough to stick her gun barrel out. She aimed the shotgun the best she could, stock pressed tight against her shoulder. Just like Robert had taught her. The pocked shirtless man had not been fazed by his companion's fall, and continued forward, arms stretching out toward the opening. He was close enough to grab a hold of the shotgun. "Nana," Emma squealed. "Get the hell off my lawn," Margaret commanded. Margaret winced as the diseased man clawed at her, and she hesitated for only a second, but once the man's head connected with the gun barrel, she pulled the trigger. A thunderous boom clapped. The man's top half of his head, cut off at the jaw, shot off like a hockey puck. Blood splattered the glass, along with chunks of hair and gore. His body fell to its knees before slumping to the ground with a soft thud. Luckily for Margaret, the crack in the door was small enough that she avoided the gory aftermath. The last creature still struggled in the broken swing. Margaret was quick to push another shell into place and crack the shotgun barrel back into place. She was surprised in the steadiness of her hands as she loaded the thing. Perhaps it was muscle memory from the few times Robert had shown her how to use it. Sliding the gun back through the small opening in the sliding door, Margaret took aim at the lumbering beast. It was dragging the swing now, still caught and wearing it like a skirt. It didn't seem to notice the obstruction. Instead, it kept focused on the door with a dull fascination. She aimed for the creature's skull, but its awkward movement made it hard to track, not to mention her shoulder still ached from the first shot. Holding her breath, she pulled the trigger. An ear-piercing crack followed. Margaret's glasses slid down the bridge of her nose, which she blamed for having missed her shot. Instead of hitting the creature head-on, it blew a sizable gap off the top of its hump. The creature roared in pain. The way the first man had lumbered about without fear of injury made Margaret believe these things weren't sentient, or couldn't feel pain at the least, but the way this other creature eyed her afterward made her second-guess herself. Perhaps there was more to these creatures than she thought. Still howling, the large disease-ridden creature picked up the swing that still hung from his waist. With a two-armed slam, the creature smashed the swing on the concrete slab, sending splinters of wood flying. Expecting what would happen next, Margaret turned to flee. "Run!" she shouted to Emma. Margaret wasn't as spry as she once was. Every movement hurt, and speed was not a trait she possessed. Maybe she should turn and buy Emma more time. Maybe. Emma, ignoring Margaret's warning, grabbed a hold of her and pulled her toward the hallway. The momentum was enough to pull Margaret out of the kitchen, just in time as glass exploded inward. The beast ripped through both doors and crashed into the refrigerator directly across from the opening. The old appliance dented before toppling over the intruder. Trinkets and figurines that sat atop her cabinets fell about the kitchen, and the sounds of glass shattering echoed throughout the room. Emma and Margaret cleared the kitchen and retreated down the hallway and into the craft room. Margaret turned back in time to see the creature slide out from underneath the refrigerator, unfazed by the many new cuts on his body. Even with his slack jaw, he snarled, sending spittle and fresh blood flying. Margaret slammed the door shut behind them, not bothering to lock it. There wouldn't be a point after all, given what that thing did to her kitchen. Instead, she focused on pushing another shell into the barrel. "What the hell is that thing?" Emma cried from behind Margaret. "Language, dear," Margaret said, shouldering the shotgun into place. It didn't take long for the gorilla-like monster to find the door. With a punch from an oversized arm, the door ripped off its hinges, hitting Margaret and knocking her backward. Pain lanced her back as she hit the floor, and the ruined door fell on top of her. Luckily, she had the fortitude to not waste a shot. The creature reached for her, but it could not fit through the door opening. Its shoulders were too wide for the frame. Still, it pushed and strained as if it could force the threshold to fold under its power. To the beast's credit, drywall crumbled around the frame and chunks fell from the roof. He would be on them in seconds. The busted door pinned Margaret's legs to the floor. She could not get to her feet, and wasn't even sure if she could if the door hadn't been pinning her. That didn't matter. This thing wasn't getting in. She wouldn't let it get near Emma. So she pulled the shotgun up, bracing the stock against the floor. The monster's unhinged jaw smacked against decaying upper teeth, and its tongue fell to the side, flapping about like a crazed dog. Hunger filled its dull blue eyes. "You look hungry," Margaret breathed. The creature was rewarded by its efforts, and pushed further into the room. Far enough that it lumbered over Margaret's fallen body, its mouth snapping only a few feet above her. Drool and blood splashed onto her face. Margaret could vaguely sense Emma screaming. Margaret slid the end of the shotgun into the creature's gaping maw. No one leaves Grandma's house hungry. She pulled back on the trigger, and a hollow boom erupted. Chapter 4. Coats and Fanny Packs. It was a bitter fall night. The leaves had already changed colors and fallen to the streets below. Margaret was dolled up. She had tied her long blonde hair with a red ribbon which she accented with the same shade of lipstick. She leaned in close, sliding her arm into the crook of Robert's elbow as he parked the '57 Chevy Bel Air coupe into a parking spot near the back of the lot. The factory was doing well that year, and because of this, they had rewarded their employees by passing out bonuses. When Robert had shared the news with Margaret, it relieved her to hear they would receive some cushion in their already tight budget. But Robert had other plans. He had said, "Put on your pearls, gorgeous, because tonight, I'm taking my girl out for a night on the town." Since their wedding, they barely had the time or the money to go out anymore. Robert worked long hours to cover the bills and keep food on the table, and still they merely scraped by. Margaret wanted to object to the idea, but she had been itching to get out of the house, and she missed when Robert used to court her. So instead she did what Robert had asked and strapped on her mother's pearls. Once the car parked, Robert swung his arm around and pulled her closer. She could still picture him from that night. His hair was slicked to the side, but a stubborn strand of hair protested and framed the left side of his face. He wore a white-collared shirt with a blue jacket over it. Margaret remembered the jacket because she caught sight of a hole in the armpit as he lifted his arm around her. She really needed to patch that, she remembered thinking. The drive-in theater was a year old by the time Margaret and Robert had scraped together enough money to visit. She had never been to a drive-in before, and she was very excited. That night had been a horror double feature. They had started the night with Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, which was truly horrifying. Margaret had given a suspicious eye to every raven she happened upon since seeing the film. But the real reason this memory came to mind was because of the last movie, Night of the Living Dead. In this film, a group of people were trapped in a farmhouse as they were barraged by growing hordes of zombies. As unsettling as The Birds had been, this movie gave Margaret nightmares. The idea of zombies had been foreign to her at the time. Ashamed as she had been, she even had Robert take her home early. If she remembered right, Robert had been properly rewarded though. The thought brought a smile to her face. But the memory was short-lived. As she looked down on the mutilated corpse below her, bleeding all over her craft room floor, she couldn't help but think of the zombies from that film. Sure, this creature had been much larger than a normal zombie, but his awkward gait, his unhinged jaw, and the fact it had been eating her neighbor only minutes before, it all suggested that's exactly what it was, a zombie. Margaret plugged her nose. Even freshly killed, the beast smelled like a sack of sour meat that had been left out in the summer heat. She tried breathing through her mouth, but after tasting rot in the air she opted for covering with a handkerchief. "Are you sure you're okay, Nana?" Emma asked, placing a soft hand on Margaret's shoulder. "That door landed right on top of you." "I'm fine, dear," Margaret said, removing the handkerchief. Emma had pulled the door off of her after the zombie had fallen. In truth, Margaret's back throbbed. Showing weakness wouldn't do anything though. Emma needed reassurance right now. Emma gave her a look of concern, despite the declaration. Margaret had almost forgotten, given the commotion. Her face had been splattered with the behemoth's blood. When she fired that shot, its face had been in very close proximity. Naturally, she was covered in gore. She could only imagine what her white curls looked like at the moment. Splattered red, her hair probably resembled that clown's from the burger commercial. She hurriedly wiped her face with the handkerchief. Once done, she ran a hand through her hair. Sure enough, her scalp was matted down. "We should go," Emma said, heading out of the room. She reached for her phone and began ticking at the screen. Margaret hoped she was texting her mother. She was worried about Patricia too, at the moment. Margaret followed Emma while pocketing the bloody rag. "Go where?" "Nana, I don't know what these things are, but I bet these aren't the only two around. All I know is we can't stay here." Emma separated the blinds on the front window and shook her head. "We definitely can't stay here. Have you heard from your mother? Margaret asked. Patricia lived farther outside town, which meant she probably hadn't encountered any of these things yet. And to be honest, Margaret was worried about her. Emma was young, but she was a strong spirit. Patricia seemed to lack that strength. She may never say it, but she needed Margaret. God knows how her husband would react to this mess. No. And Dad's probably still in town. Do you think she is okay? Emma asked, pulling out her phone, not waiting for a reply. She frantically started dialing. With the phone to her ear, she began pacing about. Apparently, Emma was just as worried about Patricia as Margaret had been. But Margaret only asked because she assumed that is who she had been texting. Margaret glanced over at her destroyed kitchen. A gaping hole sat where her walkout door should have been. Emma was right, they definitely could not stay here. If there were more of those things like Emma had indicated, they could easily walk right through that opening. Damn it. Emma breathed. Language, Margaret commented as she headed deeper into the kitchen. She assessed the damage for a few moments. She's not answering. I even tried texting her. The old coffee tin lying sideways on the floor caught Margaret's eye. She bent over using the shotgun for support and scooped up the can. There were still plenty of shells in there. Nana. I'm scared, Emma murmured from the other room. Margaret shuffled back into the living room and pulled Emma into an embrace. The two were about the same height. Emma pushed her face into Margaret's shoulder. Other than a sniffle, she seemed to be holding herself together given their situation. It'll be all right, dear. You know how your mother is. Your father is probably already home. He will keep her safe. Margaret doubted that were the case, but she would not tell Emma that. I don't know. Emma trailed. Well, I'll tell you what. We will head over there and find out for ourselves. Your house is much farther out than mine, so it's probably much safer. There are more of them out there, Nana, Emma said, letting go of Margaret. It looks like the end of the world. Margaret threw a dismissive hand. People have been saying those things since I was a little girl. Besides, this neighborhood was going to shit anyway. Nana, Emma said with a laugh. I don't think I've ever heard you curse before. You're right. I'm sorry, dear. It's been a rough day. It had surprised Margaret she let that slip, but she was happy that it brightened her granddaughter, if even for a moment. Now grab your coat because we're leaving. It's not that cold. I don't think I'll need. Ah, Margaret interrupted. End of the world or not, you're putting on a coat. I won't have you catching a cold. As Emma pulled a coat on, Margaret shook the coffee tin, rattling the shells within. Holding the can and the shotgun had been difficult. She needed something more convenient if she was going out there. She wasn't as quick as she had once been, and she could use every advantage she could muster. Margaret snapped her fingers at a thought, causing Emma to jump and miss a sleeve. Shuffling into the craft room, Margaret let the gun rest against the wall just outside. She popped the lid off the tin and grabbed a fanny pack from one of her craft boxes. She used it to hold change at all of her craft shows. It would be perfect for the shotgun shells. She dumped the contents of the tin into the bag and strapped it tightly to her waist. There, she said to herself. That's much better. Grabbing her shotgun, she paused in the hallway before eventually meandering into her room. She took in the comforting scent one more time. Given the situation, it was occurring to her she may never see her house again. The house could be overrun, or maybe she would be killed by those things. Chances were slim that she would be back. Memories of lying next to Robert filled her. They would lie on that very mattress watching old reruns of the Andy Griffith Show, sometimes bewitched if she had control of the remote, which was often. Robert usually protested, but it had all been a front. She knew he had liked the show just as much as she did, probably because of Elizabeth Montgomery. He had always told her that Samantha looked just like Margaret when she had been younger. Margaret swallowed down the sadness creeping up her throat and headed back into the living room. Emma waited for her, armed with a broken leg from Margaret's kitchen table. She looked a little shaken up, but she still had a determined gleam in her eye. Margaret merely nodded her head in approval. "Are you ready?" she asked, heading toward the front door. Emma did not follow. "Nana, aren't you forgetting something?" Margaret's mind raced with what she could be referring to, but she couldn't think of anything. She had her shotgun and shells. What else did she need? "What would that be, dear?" "Your coat." Margaret looked down and sure enough, she had forgotten to grab her coat. "We can't have you catching a cold out there," Emma said with a smile. "You're right, dear," Margaret said, returning the smile. "Very right indeed." Chapter 5. There goes the neighborhood. Emma fought back the urge to check her pocket. Had that been a vibration she felt? Maybe it was Danny. She was so worried about him. It wasn't like him to not answer her like this. He should have already been on his way to pick her up from Nana's house. She planned to sneak out after visiting for a bit, so she could spend some alone time with Danny. In his last text, he had already passed the Shell station, which was only 5 minutes away from Nana's neighborhood. But ever since those things attacked, her phone had been eerily inactive. Unable to fight the urge any longer, she reached down and checked her phone. No new notifications lit the screen. Sighing, she repocketed the phone. She looked back to see Nana still struggling with her coat. She probably wouldn't be having such a hard time if she would just set that gun down for a second, Emma thought. Deciding it wasn't a bad idea to scout ahead a little, Emma opened the front door. Even though Emma had glanced horrific sights from the front window moments earlier, she was still shocked at what she saw. The neighborhood looked like a scene from The Walking Dead. People ran about screaming, some firing guns at hordes of invading undead, others swatting the creatures with whatever hard objects they could find. A middle-aged woman Emma did not recognize ran by, a large zombie barreling after her. The zombie looked very similar to the one Nana had shot in the craft room. It had a large hump just like the other one, only this zombie's hump was lower, causing the creature to run on all fours. It had massive arms and a disproportional torso. If these things were zombies, they differed from any movie she had ever seen. They were not slow, in fact they ran quite fast. They also varied in size, which was odd. Some didn't even appear like they had once been human. Even more frightening than their appearance, they seemed to have a small bit of intelligence. Not much, but they had enough to be terrifying. Emma looked down at the wooden table leg she gripped like a baseball bat, and shook her head. She wouldn't be able to do anything with this. Maybe she could bash in one of the more human-looking ones, but if she came across one of those big ones, her only hope would be to run. The screaming woman did not make it far. The massive zombie tackled her from behind, biting into the woman's shoulder as they landed. Her cries of pain only attracted more undead. They came from all directions, circling the flailing woman. Eventually, the screaming stopped. There were now 4 zombies feasting on her body. One zombie pulled at the woman's abdomen and produced a string of what looked like bloody sausage links. It kept pulling like a magician, using the never-ending scarf magic trick. Feeling faint, Emma averted her gaze. She wished she could have helped the woman, but there was nothing she could do. The woman had died so fast, and all Emma had was a makeshift baton. Nana's neighborhood sat directly off the main route through town. Even getting out of the neighborhood required a stoplight just to get onto the road. The police station was only a few minutes away. So that begs the question, where were the police? Forget the police, where was the army? These people were being slaughtered, and help was nowhere to be found. A pot-bellied man blasted off a shotgun in the middle of the street. The blast ripped into a sprinting zombie, chasing a little boy. The zombie flew backward, his skull missing. This one had been the size of a normal person. Relief washed over Emma as the mother scooped up the child. The pot-bellied man stopped firing and began shuffling with shells from his coat pocket. As good of a shot as he had been, his hands appeared unsteady, and he dropped more shells than he could grab. Emma cried out as another zombie came barreling from behind a hedge bush toward the man. He hadn't heard Emma's warning. He went down with screams of pain as more undead circled around him. Emma had never felt more useless than she had in that moment. All of these people, Nana, we have to go, she said, swallowing back tears. She rounded Nana's Lincoln town car that sat in the driveway. She pulled open the passenger door, which groaned in protest. Nana closed the front door of the house, and even went so far as to lock it. She gave Emma a wave to show she was on her way, as she shuffled down the sidewalk, still carrying the shotgun. Emma had no idea that Nana had a gun, let alone knew how to shoot it. Emma had always seen her grandmother as strong, she idolized her for that, but this was different. She wasn't just strong, she was a force to be reckoned with. At almost 80 years old, Nana had taken out 2 undead, including that brutish one that was the size of an elephant. It required multiple shots from a shotgun just to bring it down. The door to the Lincoln opened, and bracing on the shotgun, Nana fell into the driver's seat. Once seated, she pulled the gun into the car, standing it close by. Even with the barrel aiming toward the roof, it seemed a little dangerous to Emma. But she had no experience with guns, and didn't want to question Nana, who was more accustomed to gun etiquette. More screams erupted nearby. A van stopped near where the man had saved the boy, and looked as though it were trying to save a few people before driving off. A stocky, balding man hung outside the door of the maroon caravan, waving his arm in a hurried motion toward a woman and a teenage girl who appeared not much older than Emma. It looked like they would make it. The screams, however, were coming from another woman who must have fallen behind. A zombie missing an arm had a grip on one of her legs and was biting into her ankle. Emma did not keep watching, she knew how this would end. Seatbelt. The simple phrase caught Emma off guard. What? She asked, turning back around. Seatbelt, Nana repeated. Nana, are you not seeing what I'm seeing? I don't think a seatbelt is the most pressing concern right now. Nana adjusted the rearview mirror, fully strapped in. I may be old, but yes. I'm seeing the same things you are, but just because the world has gone to hell in a handbasket doesn't mean you should ignore the basics. They're more important than ever right now. Emma sighed in frustration as she reached for the seatbelt, but arguing would do nothing, and she wanted nothing more than to get out of there. Okay, my seatbelt is on. Now can we get out of here? Emma asked, letting some of her fear show through her tone. Nana had the car in idle, but she showed no interest in putting the car in reverse. Her attention was on the side mirror. From the direction of her gaze, Emma guessed Nana was watching the van. Nana? I think we should wait, Nana answered. Emma turned, straining against the seatbelt to get a full view of the scene unfolding behind them. Nana had been in fact watching the van, which now sped toward the neighborhood entrance. The undead horde was more congested in this area. It was as if they knew that this was the only way out by the road, and if they could choke the entrance, no one would get out. Emma hoped this wasn't by intelligent design. The van full of desperate survivors didn't seem to care. They drove full speed toward the bunched group of zombies. One Zeke, that was what Emma decided would be the best name for the zombies that appeared more like their traditional cultural counterparts, raced toward the van. The driver had been smart, and did what Emma's father had once instructed her to do, if she was ever caught in a similar scenario. A few months ago, Emma's father first showed her how to drive a car. He worked late hours often, so most of her lessons had been in the dark. Having him bark orders at her from the passenger seat with no daylight was nerve-wracking enough, but she had almost hit a deer on her first drive. It happened so fast. First, she caught the blue glint of life reflecting off of eyes on the edge of the road. It took a second for her brain to realize what it was, and when she did, she slammed on the brakes. Tires squealed and the seatbelt pulled taut, digging into her neck and breast. Her father cried out in surprise. Luckily, he was also wearing a seatbelt. Next came the smell of burning rubber. The car rocked to a complete stop inches from the deer. It gingerly walked across the road, stopping only for a moment to glare at Emma and her father. Emma's father had been spitting angry. It would be a while before he would let Emma take the wheel again. Although the experience wasn't a pleasant one, that was when she had learned that, when there's something big in the road, to speed up instead of brake. The van did just that. The Zeke exploded in a cloud of guts. What was left toppled to the concrete, and was soon squishing under spinning tires. It was at this moment that Emma noticed something strange. Given the distance, it was difficult to make out, but Emma could swear a little girl pushed her way to the front of the group of zombies blocking the entrance. She was small, maybe 8 years old, with pigtails and a dress. Her skin appeared pale, but there weren't any other signs that might show she was one of the undead. She was not covered in gore like the rest, but she had to be one of them. There was no way that those monsters could surround her and not tear her apart otherwise. Even with the van quickly closing distance and heading straight toward her, the girl did not appear afraid. In fact, she seemed angry. As if confirming the thought, the girl threw her head back and let loose a hair-standing scream. It was like nothing Emma had ever heard. It sounded nothing like a human or an animal. It sounded more like a choir of different people, screaming in the same pitch, all coming from the same entity. Two brutes, that was what Emma decided the bigger humped ones would be called, pushed their way beside the still screaming dead girl, though they did not stay there for long. Their walks turned into gallops, their gallops into a full charge. They headed straight for the van. The vehicle may have been enough to splatter a Zeke, but these two were almost the same size of the van itself. There was no way this could end well. "They're not going to make it," Emma said. "No," Nana confirmed matter-of-factly. "They are not." Emma turned to eye her grandmother. She didn't understand how she could sound so detached. Did she not care what was about to happen? The two brutes showed no sign of retreat. There was no fear in their glassy dead eyes. Emma thought these two eyes appeared even more lifeless than their compatriots, but that didn't seem likely. She must have been imagining things. Still fully committed to this game of chicken, the van continued forward at maximum speed. They were mere feet away from the two brutes. Emma's breath caught, expecting the collision. She wanted to cover her eyes, but her hands wouldn't move. Then at the last second the driver panicked, and the van swerved to the left. It was too sharp of a turn. The boxy vehicle leaned hard, and two wheels inched off the ground from the quick change in direction. The brute closest to the caravan full of survivors slammed into the right side. The push was enough to finish the job. Emma watched in horror as the van toppled onto its side. Glass windows crunched and metal screeched as it ground to a stop. Instead of riling into a frenzy like Emma would have assumed the mass horde of undead would do, they stood still and watched. Sure, some smaller ones may have twitched at the sight, stumbling forward before their feet locked into place, but in the end they just stood. They were still for so long that Emma thought maybe, just maybe, the people would get out of there alive. That was when the dead girl shrieked again. The cry was guttural and wet. It sounded like she was ripping her own vocal cords, hitting that decibel. Maybe she was. She was dead after all. Do the dead feel pain? Emma doubted they did. Emma's heart began thumping all the way to her eardrums. The sliding door of the van, now facing the sky, slid open. A pair of arms came into view as a man pulled himself up to straddle the downed vehicle like a horse. More arms came into view, and the man helped a woman out before pulling a revolver out from behind his back. The zombie mass crashed toward the survivors like a wave as more people climbed out of the van. The man straddling the side of the van began firing shots into the horde. "No!" Emma cried just as Nana's Lincoln slammed into reverse. She looked around in surprise. "Nana, what are you doing?" "We're using this," Nana replied, pushing the shifter into drive. "What?" "No, we have to help them," Emma said, knowing that she sounded insane. "Sweetie, those people are already dead. This might be our only way out of here." Emma wanted to argue, but she knew Nana was right. And ashamed as she was to admit it, she was afraid. She didn't want to die, not like how all those people were. She wanted to go home. She wanted to be with her mom and dad. She wanted to know Danny was okay. She wished he was there with her now, holding her and making her feel safe. She wanted this all to be over. This couldn't have been real anyway. She must be in a nightmare. One where the dead walked and took vengeance on the living. One where Nana had a shotgun and was surgical with it at that. Chapter 6. License to Kill. Margaret floored the gas pedal to the old Lincoln Town Car. The luxury sedan had 239 horsepower, pulling over 2 tons of metal and fury, and she intended to use every bit it would give her. Her stomach flipped at the thought of leaving those people, her neighbors, to fend for themselves. She recognized the stout, balding man with the revolver. His name was Peter Olson. He came over to fix Margaret's mailbox last summer, after a nasty storm blew it sideways. He was a pleasant fellow, and here she would repay his kindness by letting him die. It wasn't right. But Emma was her priority right now. If she wasn't with her, then maybe she could help those poor people. She wasn't concerned for her own life. She had lived a long time, and besides, there was Robert. She would love to see him again. There was something wrong with these creatures. Well, besides the fact they were eating people, there was still something more. They were too controlled, too organized. They all massed at the neighborhood entrance, like they knew it was the only way out. Common sense would say that they all grouped there because that was how they were getting in, but then again there wasn't common sense when it came to zombies. Then there was the little girl. Zombies were scary enough as it is, but there's something truly wrong with seeing such vileness in such an innocent package. The girl's body, that's what Margaret decided it was, just a shell, showed her to be maybe 7 or 8, no more than 10 for sure. The girl hadn't even been old enough to grow out of pigtails. And the way she screamed, it was like the cries of a banshee crawling out of the fires of hell. Margaret wouldn't ever be able to forget that sound. And she definitely didn't like how the other zombies reacted to the screams. Before the little girl had emerged, the fleeing van was making good on picking up survivors and splattering undead. For a moment, Margaret believed that those people would make it out of there. That was about the time the undead girl threw her horrifying tantrum. It was as if she knew that survivors would get out, and she would not let it happen. Then 2 hulking monsters rushed to her aid and charged the van. It was too organized. The girl's screams must be some kind of communication. Maybe the girl was higher in the evolutionary chain, and could command the others, like a general barking orders on a battlefield. That would explain the odd sense of organization among them, though Margaret hoped she was wrong. The concept sent shivers down her spine. Her normally shaking hands were white-knuckled and steady, wrapped around the steering wheel. The caravan's crash site came up fast and on the left. The undead crowded the area, so it was difficult to see, but Margaret could make out some of the scene through gaps of undead, and wished she hadn't. Unable to look away, she saw a woman being bitten by multiple zombies while a young man, boy really, fought off the circling attackers. The man that had been straddling the downed caravan was nowhere to be seen. Given the fact the undead were pouring into the open door, he must have retreated inside. Those people didn't stand a chance. The grim reality of the situation sank in. That could have been Margaret and Emma, turned upside down with an army of zombies circling around. It didn't sit well with her that those people were dying in front of her eyes, but there was nothing she could do. That being said, she could use this distraction. She would not let these people's lives be wasted. Emma and Margaret would get out. They would fight on. The undead girl still did not seem to notice the Lincoln barreling in her direction. In a second, Margaret and Emma would skate by the right side of the entrance where the masses of undead broke apart to fill gaps further in the line. There were only a few stragglers, and there was plenty of room to avoid them. If the van kept the zombies' attention just a little longer. The zombie girl's head snapped back in Margaret's direction. Her face was a mask of undead rage. She let out a terrifying screech. "Oh God! She sees us. Nana, she sees us!" Emma cried. Margaret groaned in frustration. They had been so close. The neighborhood entrance was within grasp. Maybe, if they hurry, they may still have a chance. Undead began peeling off the van crash site and shambling back toward the entrance. They were slow to react, their blood-covered faces still longing on the overturned van. Perhaps the zombie girl's control was limited. If that were the case, Margaret would guess they would be harder to order around once they were feeding. As more and more decaying bodies left the van, Margaret's theory was proven correct. The only zombies not reacting at all were the ones too preoccupied ripping apart the would-be survivors. Margaret could not make out the bodies, but given the different huddles of undead, it was likely none of them made it out. She whispered a prayer for the lost souls and turned her attention back to the road. "Nana, look out. Those Zeeks are heading right toward us." At first, Margaret was confused by Emma's meaning, but given the bodies rushing toward the speeding Lincoln town car, it became clear she was referring to the human-looking zombies. Margaret supposed that identifying the unique types wasn't an awful idea. She could see the usefulness in it. One of the Zeeks, this one female, sprinted from the original crowd that formed the blockade. She looked like she may have been someone's trophy wife at some point. She wore a loose top with a zipped sweatshirt, tight yoga pants and bright expensive-looking shoes. Black strands of hair slapped and clung to her face as she charged the Lincoln head-on. "Don't slow down," Emma said. Margaret glanced at her granddaughter from her peripheral. Emma had been right. If you were going to hit something big, speed up. She was a smart girl. She most definitely had been cut from the same cloth as Margaret. "Don't worry, dear. I had no intentions of stopping." The undead trophy wife smacked the front of the Lincoln, and unfortunately for Margaret and Emma, she did not go under the car. Instead, she rolled onto the hood. Time slowed for Margaret as the zombie plummeted toward the windshield headfirst, teeth gnashing. The windshield imploded. Glass cracked, and blood shot into the interior of the Lincoln as the zombie woman was propelled onto the dashboard. Most of her upper torso had made it in. Margaret was still trying to recover, but the undead woman was unfazed. She clawed and kicked to get further into the car. Emma screamed, throwing her hands up in defense. Thankfully, the zombie was closest to the driver's side, Margaret's side. Margaret gritted her teeth and reached for her shotgun still resting at her side. The zombie had an entire arm and her head in the car. She clawed at Margaret with the free hand and chomped her teeth, spewing saliva onto Margaret's face. The body blocked Margaret's view, and the zombie was much stronger than she would have imagined. It pulled on her arm, reaching for the shotgun, and it was all Margaret could do to not get bit, let alone grab the gun. Emma recovered from the shock of the collision, and she was smacking at the undead woman's arm with the table leg, but it wasn't doing much. In a panic, and not seeing any other option, Margaret slammed on the brakes. Tires squealed, and the smell of burning rubber filled the air. The zombie ejected from the broken windshield, like a shot put. The Zeke still clawed and chomped its teeth even as it flew backward. The car came to a full stop in a small gap between massing zombies. Margaret took in deep gasps of air, trying to recover. She assessed herself while taking the needed breath, and noticed fresh wounds from the zombie woman's raking fingernails, and scrapes here and there from loose bits of glass, but nothing serious. "Are you okay?" Margaret asked. Emma didn't appear hurt, other than nearly identical nicks from glass, the deepest appearing to be a cut across her cheek. A single droplet of blood seeped from the red line. "Yeah, I'm okay," Emma said, sounding surprised. "Are you?" Emma's eyes locked onto the fingernail marks, and her face went pale, but she did not comment on them. Margaret rubbed a self-conscious hand across the trails. Just a few scrapes. It's nothing, these arms haven't experienced trimming roses before. Emma did not seem comforted by Margaret's attempt to make light of her injuries. Margaret wished she could do more, but more and more undead were gathering to close the gap in the entryway. Margaret let her foot off the brake and rocked the Lincoln back into motion. Other than the sizable hole in the windshield, the Lincoln didn't seem fazed by the collision. Margaret patted the dashboard in appreciation as it gathered speed. Another Zeke came sprinting from the left and smacked into the driver's side panel of the town car. Blood splattered onto Margaret's window. She didn't even flinch. She kept the car moving toward the closing gap. A few more Zekes attempted to grab at the vehicle, but they couldn't keep a grasp on the speeding tank as Margaret swerved about. Noticing that the little undead girl's screams were growing closer instead of farther away, Margaret looked through the rear-view mirror. To her chagrin, the little brat had hitched a ride on one of the behemoth undead creatures. It trailed the Lincoln, tearing through any unfortunate being, living or dead, that got in between the two. Margaret cursed as another Zeke connected with the Lincoln, this one on the passenger side. It had managed to break the side mirror, which now dangled loose and slapped against the car like an eyeball out of socket. Margaret and Emma were nearly at the entrance now, and the gaps between undead bodies weren't big enough for the Lincoln. They would have to crash into them. Taking one hand off the wheel, Margaret grabbed the shotgun at her side. She had learned from that last zombie who had got into the cab, and she wasn't taking any chances. She would blow them away before they could roll up on the hood if she had to. A zombie flew from behind them, smacking onto the roof before tumbling over the side. It splattered on the pavement. The brute behind them had started throwing its brethren at the moving car. Margaret knew they would not last much longer like this. They would end up just like those poor people in that van, upside down and trapped like sardines in a tin can. "Hold on, sweetie," Margaret cried just as they connected with the first Zeke in the defensive line of undead. Unlike the zombie from before, this one went under instead of rolling onto the hood. The Lincoln jumped in response, but continued to barrel forward. More thumps and groans sounded from all sides of the car. Blood splattered on the windows and on what remained of the windshield. Margaret had the sensation of being trapped in an automatic car wash, only this one dispersed gore instead of suds. Margaret looked over to check on Emma, and she had her eyes squeezed shut with hands covering her ears. A few seconds, which felt like a minute, passed and the thumps ceased. The car stopped jumping and leveled out, but it was no longer running at full speed. Margaret could sense the steering wheel pulling to the left, and she had to keep overcorrecting to keep the car moving straight. There was definitely some damage, but it was still tugging along. The Lincoln was still bathed in a red tint. Margaret turned on the wipers, and blood splashed through the large hole in the windshield onto the dashboard and onto the top of her hand still gripped firmly on the steering wheel. The blood streaked with chunks of only God knows what, and the view was still distorted. Margaret rolled down her window, which was thankfully still intact, and poked her head back, slowing the car to a stop. The car now sat in a sideways angle, where Margaret could get a better view of the scene behind them. She was happy to see the Lincoln had made it through the barrier of zombies. They may have only been a few yards past the entrance, but it delighted her all the same. In fact, they were nearly to the traffic light which would signal them onto the main strip through town. It was funny to think Margaret needed a traffic light just to get out of her neighborhood. She could still remember when this whole town was merely nothing but a gas station surrounded by farmland. "Open your eyes," Margaret said. "We made it." Emma still had her hands covering her ears with eyes shut. Margaret reached over and pulled Emma's arm. Emma jerked back in response, but she calmed down quickly, seeing it was Margaret that had grabbed her. "We're okay?" Emma asked. "You sound surprised. Don't tell me zombies have ruined your positive outlook." Margaret smiled partially to lighten the mood, but mostly because she couldn't help herself. She hadn't known what to expect, and coming out the other end. Well, she changed her mind, and was happy to let Robert wait a little longer. Not necessarily, Emma started. It's more my point of view that's ruining my outlook. That confused Margaret, but the meaning became all too clear when Emma pointed a finger back behind Margaret, toward the open window facing the neighborhood entrance. She had been so relieved to have made it past the barricade of undead, she had forgotten about the deformed giant, which was now ripping through what was left of the undead blocking the entrance. Bodies and limbs flew into the air as the brute swung his massive arms. The little girl sat on top, pigtails bobbing up and down, her face contorted in fury. Margaret knew this brat would have to be stopped if she and Emma were going to get away. There was no way the undead girl would let them slip away. She was too determined, and with the control she had over the other undead, Margaret had no choice but to act. Chapter 7. A Helping Hand. Margaret opened the town car door and slowly stood onto aching limbs. What are you doing? Now is not the time for a stroll, Nana. We have to get out of here. Margaret slid the shotgun from the dash and raised it to her shoulder in a firing stance. She used the open car door as support. Between using the gun and the reckless driving, her nerves were shot. Her hands and elbows shook under even the smallest strain. If anything happens, I need you to run, Margaret said. I'm not leaving you, Emma said defiantly. Promise me. Emma didn't respond. Margaret knew that meant Emma was digging in. Please, Margaret added. She expected for Emma to give in, or maybe do what she was supposed to do, and respect her grandmother's wish, but she did neither. The passenger door creaked open, and Margaret's support on her own door shook a little. She looked over, and caught Emma getting out of the car. What are you doing? Emma walked around the front of the dented and bloody Lincoln grill, to stand beside Margaret. She was shouldering her broken table leg like a baseball bat. I'm done being scared. We'll do this together. I don't know why, but I get the feeling this little girl has control over the other ones. Maybe if we can take this thing out, the other zombies will fall apart without direction. It will give other people a fighting chance. So Emma noticed the girl's strange effect on the others too. Margaret was annoyed and too exhausted to argue. She was doing this to give Emma a fighting chance. If Margaret didn't do something, this thing would chase them all the way to Patricia's. But she couldn't blame Emma for standing her ground. Margaret, too, was tired of being afraid. It was hard to see people she knew being torn apart. The odd zombie couple closed in fast once they broke through the undead barrier. The girl sat atop the big one's head like a spider ready to pounce. Margaret watched the two rushing toward them through the barrel's front sight. She licked her dry lips and let out a slow breath. She would aim for the girl. She was obviously the most important target. Margaret guessed she had enough time to get off 4 shots if she could reload as quickly as she did before. That should be good enough to get the undead girl, but she doubted the big one would go down. If it didn't, it would likely run Margaret over. She hoped Emma had the sense to jump out of the way if that were to happen. Emma was young, and had the reflexes to do so if necessary. Margaret couldn't say the same for herself. Her hands shook, and she wanted to fire more with every step the undead beast took, but she could not miss. She wouldn't allow it. Margaret waited for her opportunity. She needed the perfect shot. There. Her inside screamed. And she pulled the trigger. The blast went wide, but clipped the undead girl's upper arm. The spread was almost wide enough to tear the arm clean off. It hung limply at an odd angle. The little zombie girl nearly fell back, but she maintained her grip on her undead steed using her other arm. The massive zombie creature had been unaffected by the blast. The shot had been almost useless. Her next shot landed in the center of the brute's chest. She hoped to slow the creature down, give her enough time to reload, but it hadn't even flinched. Panicking, Margaret pushed 2 more shells into the barrel and blindly fired again. The undead were too close for her to properly take aim. She had no idea where the blast would connect, but she knew she was hitting something given their proximity. Blood arced into the sky as the brute's face exploded upward. She had hit him. It was a headshot, only it hadn't been the head Margaret had been hoping to hit. The shot had completely missed the little girl who had been crouched on the bigger zombie's hump. Even nearly decapitated by the blast, the beast's momentum carried its body forward, right toward Margaret. Margaret tried to move, but at her age she could only move so fast. The car-sized zombie collided with the Lincoln's open driver door, the same door Margaret had been using for support, ripping it off its hinges. The Lincoln rocked forward and metal groaned. Margaret was also caught in the collision. The zombie's shoulder connected with her back as she tried to get out of the way. The force of the blow took her off her feet, and she fell on hands and knees only paces away. The little girl who had controlled the massive zombie flung from its shoulders when it collided with the car. Margaret attempted to brace her fall with her hands, but that could only do so much. She was falling too fast, her hands were too weak. When her head connected with asphalt, everything went black. When Margaret awoke, someone had been pulling on her. It was quite annoying. It was probably just Robert. Had she overslept? That wasn't like her. She was always up when Robert started his morning shower. It was then she made breakfast for the 2 of them. But no, that couldn't be it. Something wet and sticky was on her forehead. And when did her bed get so hard? Margaret sat up and was confused why she was sitting in the middle of the street. When Margaret gained her bearing, it was Emma's crying face that pulled it all together. No, it hadn't been Robert pulling on her, he was gone. Emma wasn't, though. Don't mind me, dear. I was just resting my eyes. Emma grabbed a hold of Margaret's shoulders in a fierce hug as Margaret attempted to lift herself off the hard road. The embrace sent fires of pain burning in Margaret's back, and she toppled back down, wincing. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Emma said, pulling back from her embrace. Are you okay? Margaret touched a hand to her forehead and brought back red fingertips. She was bleeding, though it didn't seem like much. She had a massive headache, though. It was the kind that throbbed behind the eyes. The bright afternoon sun only added to its aggravation. She had a few more scrapes on her knees and palms, but otherwise she seemed okay. I'm fine, she said with a wave of a hand. What about that thing? Is it? I think so, Emma said, looking back. I checked it over before I came to check on you. It's pretty dead. Well, more dead than before, I guess. The little one, too? Margaret knew the shot that connected wouldn't be enough to take the undead girl out, but maybe the fall could have finished her. That big one could have easily crushed her. I think you should see this, Emma said. Margaret could tell from the look on her face that the fall had indeed not killed the zombie girl. Emma looped an arm under Margaret and helped her to her feet. Margaret was thankful that her granddaughter was there for support, because now that she was standing, the ache in her back returned in full force. There, Emma nodded past the undead beast Margaret had downed. The monstrous zombie bled out onto the road, with a head looking like a cracked watermelon. The car door lay underneath the creature. Margaret felt a sense of satisfaction seeing the monster unmoving and dead. Hopefully it stays dead this time, but that wasn't what Emma had been nodding at. About a dozen paces past the dead zombie was an arm, a little girl's arm. A bleached white bone spiked out of one end, and Margaret caught a few shotgun pellets next to the wound. They inched closer. You think it's hers? Emma asked. I do, Margaret said. She had no doubt that it was. Question is, where's the rest of her? Chapter 8. Red Tape. Margaret was fortunate enough to have missed the Great Depression, but that didn't mean that she had been exempt from the echoes of pain it left behind. Her father had often spoken of those days. She had grown up on a farm, only 20 acres, but it was plenty big enough to support the family. This should have made food more available to her family during those times, but the sorrow affected not only the market, it also seeped into the ground. Disease had spread to crops, and the harvests were meager. Margaret's older brother had been around while this was happening, but he had only been a baby. That hadn't kept him from telling stories to Margaret, as if he had remembered the entire event. When the end comes, it comes fast, he used to say. Even if he had been exaggerating or just retelling stories he had heard from their parents, Margaret had found truth in those words. And as prophesied, the end took everyone by surprise. The highway was in chaos. Cars lined the roads. Some honked their horns, others made daring moves to avoid being bunched with the non-moving masses. It was pointless, though. There were just too many people. The north side of the highway was at a complete stop. It led to Highway 70, which ran across the entire country, coast to coast. Margaret, however, was on the south side, heading away from the major highway. That was where Emma and Patricia lived. Margaret had no interest in leaving, and she certainly wasn't going anywhere without her daughter. Wind barraged the Lincoln, even though the car hardly went over 10 miles per hour. Margaret inwardly cursed the undead buffoon, who had inconsiderately relieved her of a driver's side door. Why couldn't the giant oaf have fallen backward instead? That would have solved the door issue, and perhaps the undead girl. But no, his momentum had taken him forward, destroying the Lincoln's door and knocking Margaret to the ground. The gaping hole in the windshield also didn't help her current situation. Margaret turned to look at Emma. She was buried in her phone again, her little thumbs dancing across the screen. Margaret never ceased to be amazed at how fast young people were at typing on such little devices. She still remembered the days of typewriters. She had friends who had gone off to school for that. Nowadays, it seemed like babies were born digitally inclined to pounding at screens. "Is that your mother?" Margaret asked. It was difficult to have any kind of discussion in the wind tunnel of a car, but nevertheless her question seemed to take Emma by surprise. Emma looked up sheepishly. "No, she still hasn't answered. I'm just checking on a friend." "Is your friend okay?" "I don't know," Emma said, pocketing her phone. "He hasn't answered me. No one is answering me." Emma turned toward her window and began nibbling on a fingernail. Margaret knew Emma was worried. She was strong, not invincible. She was just a kid after all. Margaret wished there was something she could say to ease some of those worries, but in all honesty she was concerned too. The car came to a full stop just in time for a young man to slide across her hood. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, and had a moderately sized package under one arm. He was moving too fast for Margaret to make out exactly what it was he was carrying, but it looked like it may have been a laptop. She looked in the direction he had come from, and noticed the shopping center across the street. The parking lot was in chaos. Cars sped in every which direction, and people ducked and dodged around the entrances. At first glance, Margaret thought the store had been under attack, much like her neighborhood, but after noticing all of those fleeing figures carrying boxes and bags, she realized it was being looted. She wasn't surprised. The state had certainly seen its share of looting. A zombie epidemic was just another event to take advantage of. Looking around, the shopping center wasn't the only victim of looting. Other stores fared the same fate, especially the bigger box stores. The sight made Margaret wonder where the police were. She had seen a few ambulances pass by, but she hadn't seen a single policeman yet. The thought was soon answered. At the center of the jam, blue and red lights flashed from dozens of emergency vehicles. Most of the vehicles were parked sideways, blocking both sides of the main road. A few policemen in bright-colored vests were unwinding wire and placing blockades along the road. Other members of the force were in heavy riot gear and carried military-style weapons, and others were merely in their street uniforms directing traffic or leaning into vehicles. Margaret was relieved at the sight. She halted the vehicle behind a truck covered in profane stickers and watched as a heavy-set officer approached the driver's window. The two men's conversation was brief, and the police officer stepped aside to let the truck through the barricade. Margaret pulled the Lincoln Town car forward and stopped where the truck had been just seconds before. She was greeted by the same stocky policeman in a beat cop uniform, while an officer in riot gear stood close by. "Jesus H. Christ," the beat cop said with a whistle. "It looks like you ladies have been through some shit." His eyes were like saucers as he assessed their vehicle, a blood-splattered and dented grille, the hole in the windshield surrounded by web-like fractures, and finally the missing driver's side door. He leaned down to meet Margaret's eyes, and his brows furrowed at the sight of her. Much like the old Lincoln, Margaret had seen better days. "Ma'am, you all right?" "Tired, but I'll live," Margaret managed. "We're trying to get across town and check on this one's mother. We're terribly worried about her. Any chance we can get through?" The cop leaned sideways and inspected the rest of the vehicle, still looking concerned. "I think you need to be looked at first. You're not looking too good, and I don't feel comfortable letting you two ladies pass with the crazies out and about. I appreciate your concern, but we really are quite all right. I can check into a hospital once I check on my daughter." Margaret had no intention of doing such a thing. The hospital was probably the least safe place in the city, given the situation. "Just check in over at the station there," the cop said, pointing over to a parking lot that had been converted into a medical station with ambulances and large tents. "After they patch you up and clear you two, I'll let you pass through, no questions. How's that sound?" Margaret opened her mouth to reply, but the sizable man did not give her time. "Officer Lombardi will show you where to park and get situated," he said, waving over the cop in riot gear. Then he stepped back, gesturing for the next car to pull up, as Officer Lombardi stepped to the side and started leading Margaret to the parking lot on the right. There was a disturbing amount of empty vehicles parked there. Either there were more people hurt than Margaret could imagine, or perhaps this was a last stop, and their cars were left behind like gravestones. "This is just a quick detour," Margaret reassured Emma. The girl's eyes had been darting around ever since they hit the barricade. She was either very observant or looking for something. Or someone, Margaret thought. "I'm fine. I think you should do what the police say, Nana," Emma said. "I would feel a million times better if someone looked at you. You hit your head pretty hard, not to mention a door fell on top of you. As tough as you are, you're not invincible." Margaret turned the wheel, bringing the car to rest in what loosely could be called a parking spot. The officer leading them threw up his palm and began looking around. "Well, don't tell those things that," Margaret said. "I think they are just now starting to get a little frightened of me." Margaret audibly groaned as she pulled herself from her seat. After stretching out her back, she reached back into the car and grabbed her shotgun. "I don't think you'll need that," a muffled voice said. Margaret pretended not to notice the comment and continued toward the tented area. Officer Lombardi pulled down his mask and spoke again. "Ma'am, you won't be needing the gun." This time he stepped forward. He had a deep 5 o'clock shadow and looked to be in his mid-30s. Margaret would guess, given his dark hair and last name, that he had a strong Italian influence in his bloodline. "I'm sorry, young man, but clearly you haven't seen what's been going on out there." "I will certainly be keeping the gun with me," Margaret said, glaring at the man. She assumed he would continue to protest, maybe even threaten to arrest her, but instead he looked intrigued. "What's it like?" he said, eyes full of childlike wonder. "What's it like?" Margaret repeated. Had these men not even seen these things before? What had they been doing? Just setting up roadblocks while everyone else fought for their lives? What it's like is a sick boy's nightmare come true. "I wouldn't know," Officer Lombardi said flatly. "I've been stuck here. There's nothing more frustrating than just standing around while all the action is out there. Chief's orders, though. Enjoy the peace while you can, officer. The action will make its way to you." Of that I am sure. Annoyed with the man, Margaret turned to head for the medical tent. She was too exhausted to hide the limp from her aching back. "You need any help?" Officer Lombardi said, stepping forward. He placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder, but she quickly shrugged it away. "I may be old, but I am not feeble. I am quite capable of walking 20 yards without your help. Emma, let's go." "Actually, Nana, I'd like to stay back and see if I can find my friend," Emma said. "I'd rather not get separated right now," Margaret said. If things went south, she preferred that Emma be close. When the end comes, it comes fast. "I can keep an eye on her, ma'am," Officer Lombardi interjected. "I'll run her across the few resting stations we have, and I'll bring her right back to you." He flashed a reassuring smile. Margaret wanted to ram the end of her shotgun into the man's gut. She always felt like she had a natural ability to see through people for who they really were, and her gut said that the man was genuinely just trying to help. As annoyed as she was, maybe it wouldn't be a bad thing to let Emma look around. Maybe she would find her friend. That would definitely eliminate some of her worries, and she would have her very own bodyguard with her at that. She would more than likely be safer with Officer Lombardi than Margaret at the moment. "Okay," Margaret said. "But if anything happens to her in my absence, you'll get it back tenfold. I don't care if you are a man of the law or not." She gave her shotgun a pat to emphasize her point. Chapter 9. Personal Bodyguard. "She's a tough old bird, isn't she?" Officer Lombardi asked with a smirk on his face. "You have no idea," Emma sang. "Well, follow me then. I'd rather not have her waiting too long. I can only imagine how she is when she is angry. You can call me Scott, by the way." Emma had a hard time remembering a time when Nana had been angry. Scott was probably only joking, but still, the thought of someone being intimidated by Nana brought a smile to Emma's face. She was such a sweet little old lady. "And I'm Emma," Emma replied. Emma fell into step behind Scott, who started walking back toward the barricade. She followed blindly while looking side to side, hoping to catch sight of Danny. It was very possible he had been caught in the roadblock. "So, are you going to tell me what's going on out there?" Scott asked over his shoulder. "I'm hoping you're a little less cryptic than your grandmother." "You really don't know?" Emma asked. She found it hard to believe that the police had no idea about the zombies. If anyone should know anything, it should be the government. "Sure, we've heard things, nothing that makes any sense though. Some folks are angry about the roadblock cutting into their Saturday afternoon, but others are hysterical with talk of monsters. I'm sure something is going on, but everything has been very hush-hush from the higher-ups." "I'm not sure you'd believe me if I told you," Emma said. "Try me. Zombies are attacking neighborhoods." "Bullshit," Scott said with a laugh. "See," Emma replied. "I knew you wouldn't believe me." "Zombies? Like the slow moaning brain-eating zombies?" "Not quite, they're much worse. Have you ever seen Dawn of the Dead or 28 Days Later?" "Not much of a horror guy," Scott answered. "Well, they aren't slow by any means. They're fast. Not only that, they seem smarter than the movies would suggest. They blocked off the entrance to our neighborhood while others went from house to house, you know," Emma finished. She didn't want to think about what had happened. It was all too fresh. Scott stopped short of a small crowd of people taking shade under a canopy. He turned to meet Emma's eyes. "You're serious, aren't you?" "You saw the car," she said. "What else do you think could have happened? We drove through a herd of cows?" Scott stared at her for a moment, probably considering her sarcasm as the truth. It seemed more realistic than what was actually happening. "Let's say I believe you. Are you telling me you've killed one?" "I haven't. Nana has killed a few though." Emma hoped that Scott believed her. If they thought she was making this all up, and that the zombies were actually people, She may have just landed her grandmother a prison sentence. Besides, I couldn't kill any of those big ones. Not without a gun, anyway. What do you mean, big ones? Scott asked. They're not all the same. It's like there's a hierarchy or something. There are your everyday normal zombies. Well, as normal as zombies can be. I call these Zeeks. Then there are the big ones I was talking about. They're massive, and barely look like they could have once been human. They have weird growths all over them, and walk like gorillas. I call these guys brutes. You realize how crazy this sounds, right? Scott interrupted. Fully, Emma continued. But you asked. I just wanted to make sure. Go on then. Scott twirled a hand. The scariest one we saw, though, was a little girl zombie. Emma thought back to the undead girl wailing in rage as her grandmother's Lincoln passed by, and how the wave of zombies altered their direction at her cries. I think she was controlling the others. I haven't given that one a name yet, but I'm thinking Banshee is a suitable name given the way she screams. Both Emma and Scott were quiet for a moment. The silence was long enough for Scott to shift on his feet. Your grandma was right. That sounds like the stuff of nightmares. Emma realized she had been staring into nothingness, and snapped herself out of it to look at Scott. She could tell he did not believe her, not fully anyway. It didn't matter, he would see soon enough the horrors they faced. Well, if they show up here, they'll regret it, Scott said, tapping the gun at his waist. Better to get you back before that happens, though. The tent up there is where some of the civilians are giving statements. Most people just want to get through, but the ones who aren't hurt and have stories to tell stop in there. If your friend is anywhere, they'll be there. Emma searched the tented area, which appeared to be an outside waiting area full of panicked people. At the end of the line was a large fold-out banquet table, with officers quickly jotting down witnesses' stories. Some were crying, some people were yelling, but overall most people just stood silently. They looked dazed. Emma understood the feeling. The past few hours still felt unreal to her, like it were all a bad movie she had seen so long ago, or a dream that just began to scratch back into her memory. As she walked through the lines, Scott trailed her, though he kept a respectable distance, giving her room to breathe. She felt like she had her very own bodyguard, which right now she really appreciated. It didn't take long to go through the lines and check faces. Her heart sank as she reached the last corner of the tented area, only to realize Danny wasn't there. She checked her phone again, hoping for any clue where he might be, but still no messages. When she headed back outside, Scott caught up to her. Didn't see your friend then? He asked. Nope, Emma said, swallowing down the urge for sarcasm. Scott was a nice enough guy, but she found herself agitated with his question. Of course she had not found Danny. There was no need to poke at an open wound. She squinted in the afternoon sun, and caught sight of the medical area they had initially arrived at. The ambulances still had their lights on, and she could see the battered Lincoln parked not far from there. I think I can get back on my own. I'm sure you have enough to worry about here. Not a chance, Scott said, matching her pace. I'm not risking that old woman's wrath. You saw the way she patted that shotgun, right? The two of them glided past the crowd of concerned passerbys, staying behind the makeshift barricade. Once they came to the roadblock, they left the safety of the fencing to maneuver around a line of cars and shuffling police officers. Emma was glad that Scott had stuck with her. She felt intimidated by all the cars filled with angry people, and she couldn't help but imagine one of the undead rushing from on the vehicles to lash out at her. They had crossed the southbound lanes and were halfway back to the medical area when Emma heard her name. It had been faint, almost a whisper over all the commotion, but still she had heard it. She turned, her heart already thumping out of control at the prospect of seeing Danny. But in the sea of vehicles and faces, Danny was still not there. Emma, she heard again. This time her eyes focused in the direction she heard her name. A man was getting out of a pristine silver Audi, pulled to the side of the road. The car was so clean that sunlight caught and reflected off of it like a disco ball. Though she was happy to see the face, Emma's heart still sank. It wasn't Danny. "Dad. You're all right," she said as the man stepped closer. "Of course I'm all right. What's going on? Is that a cut on your face?" Emma reached up, touching the now scabbed cut. It didn't hurt, so she hadn't really thought about it. "Yeah, I guess it was from the broken windshield." "Broken windshield?" her father barked. "What the hell did that crazy old woman do now? Did she get into an accident?" Emma opened her mouth to answer, but her father continued on. "I knew it. I knew it, and I told your mother we needed to take away that woman's license years ago. This is exactly what I said would happen. That old bat is going to get someone killed. Even worse, she could have gotten you killed." He looked past Emma and seemed to notice Scott looming behind her. "I'm guessing this is what the holdup is over? Was there anyone else hurt?" Scott looked back and forth between Emma and her father. He was obviously as confused as Emma was. "No, sir, there wasn't an accident. I will take a wild guess and say you've managed to avoid all the messed up stories we've been hearing about." "What are you talking about?" Emma's father asked, face growing red in frustration. "Emma, what is going on?" Emma bit her lip, trying to find the best way to start. Her father wouldn't believe a word of what she would say. Before she could answer, movement caught her eye. Something was moving quickly through the maze of parked cars to their right. She squinted, trying to get a better look. It looked like a person running full sprint. Whoever it was flailed their arms in awkward motions, making them appear crazed. As they grew close, it became clear that they were heading straight toward Emma, her father, and Scott. Emma's stomach dropped when the realization hit her. Her brain tried warning her of this possibility not long ago, and now it was happening for real. That wasn't a person running toward her, it was one of them. "Look out," she screamed. Scott jumped at her sudden outburst and followed her gaze toward the charging figure. Her father merely stared at her, as if she had lost her mind. The Zeke, as Emma had named them, was only feet away. Its mouth snapping, arms flailing and legs pumping, the undead man grew closer and closer. "Shoot it. Scott, shoot it." Scott fumbled with the gun at his hip. His eyes were wide and his hands shook. He was not ready. They were going to die, Emma thought. A loud cracking noise popped in Emma's eardrums. A mist of blood and chunks of rotting flesh flew as the Zeke's body tumbled to the ground. Emma glanced over at Scott, assuming he had managed to get to his gun in time, but he stood slack-jawed and still tangled in his gun strap. Behind the group stood her Nana, with a bandage wrapped around her skull like she was a karate master. In her arms she carried her shotgun with the barrel still smoking. "Nathaniel," she muttered, as if the very name was an insult. "I see you've managed to survive." Emma's father, Nathan, was covered in the Zeke's aftermath. His face was the canvas of a Jackson Pollock painting, only instead of paint he was splattered in gore. He brushed a finger across his cheek and pulled back a blood-covered finger. And that was when he started screaming. Chapter 10. Return of the Dead. After Nathan stopped screaming, he was escorted to the medical center. He would be fine, of course. Margaret knew that much. He wasn't in her line of fire when she pulled the trigger. She probably saved his life, given the way Officer Lombardi struggled with his gun. He seemed so eager for a chance to prove himself when she left Emma with him, but when the action finally came, the man froze. He may have been incompetent there, but when the police began surrounding Margaret yelling for her to drop the gun, Officer Lombardi had spoken up for her. Now, a circle of officers surrounded the downed Zeke. Most of them look horrified. Between the zombies, looting and chaos, Margaret would never understand how these men had been so sheltered. "I'm sorry," Scott said beside Margaret. "I don't know what happened. I've never hesitated like that before. That wasn't me." Margaret took her eyes away from the group, examining the undead corpse. It all turned out okay, she said. She decided it best to spare Scott a verbal lashing, given how he had kept her from getting locked up or shot down. No, it's not okay. Emma could have been hurt, because I was too dumbfounded to act. I promise I'll show you I can do better. Margaret nodded in response. She didn't plan on sticking around long enough for Scott to live up to that promise, but she appreciated his sincerity. Where are you two going? Maybe I can escort you to where you need to go. It's the least I can do. The offer surprised Margaret. Given the situation, she couldn't imagine Scott being able to provide an escort. Well, as soon as Nathaniel is cleaned up and can manage to get himself together, we'll head to Emma's. In times like these, it's important families stick together. Won't you be missed if you leave? Scott threw an arm behind his head and began rubbing his neck. I don't think the captain would be too happy, but it's pretty chaotic right now. I can probably get you all safely home before anyone even notices I'm gone. I'll take you up on that offer then. Margaret looked over at Emma, as her blonde hair whipped about her eyes. She still wore the small cuts from when the windshield busted. We're both tired, and a little help would be appreciated. Dad will be with us, Emma said. Like I said, Margaret continued. Help would be appreciated. Scott smiled at the comment. He didn't seem like he had been around Nathan very long, but Margaret supposed it was long enough for Scott to realize what kind of person he was. Emma, why don't you go check on your dad? See if he's ready to go. I'm itching to get out of here and check on your mother. Emma nodded and took off toward the medical area, leaving just Margaret and Scott. Margaret looked over the lengthy line of cars, slowly moving through the barricade. She couldn't help but think about the carnage that could happen if a group of zombies like the group at her neighborhood attacked. These people would be trapped. It would be a massacre. Officer Lombardi, what's the point of this roadblock? It was never really clear. Most of us thought it was a drill, until we started hearing some of the stories. All we were told was to block off the road and check cars as they came through. We were to not let anyone through that appeared to be sick. They would be sent to the medical area and could only be cleared by a doctor. We were also told to look for any suspicious persons. They didn't elaborate on suspicious, but I'm betting they meant like that guy over there. Scott gestured a thumb over his shoulder, pointing toward the Zeke Margaret had taken down. You guys should open the barricade and let these people through. We can't do that, against orders. Besides, we're helping everyone we can. That might be true, but having everyone bottlenecked in here isn't good. When these things come, they'll come in numbers. Look, I agree with you. Emma told me a little of what you all went through, and I'll admit I was skeptical, but after seeing one for myself, I'm a believer. But I can tell you right now, they didn't set these fences up to look pretty. I'm betting this will be a strategic cut-off point. We're in the perfect position to choke the flow onto the interstate. Margaret glared at Scott. These men were being foolish. They were going to cost innocent lives just following blind orders. Scott squirmed under her gaze. All right, he said with a sigh. I'll see if I can find the captain, and see if we can speed this process up. You're coming with me, though. Your story may help. Thank you, Officer Lombardi, Margaret said. I'll gladly give my account, if it had a chance of saving lives. And honestly, Scott continued, you kind of scare the shit out of me. So I'm hoping you can do the same to the captain. Language, Margaret scolded. Right. See what I mean? The two began walking back toward the barricade, when a piercing scream made them freeze in their tracks. The circle of officers investigating the fallen zombie also stood and turned toward the direction the scream came from. Margaret eyed the horizon, fear clutching at her throat. We're too late, she said. Another scream. People started getting out of the cars and turning toward the growing number of screams. A woman in a white sundress came sprinting through the line of cars. It was hard to tell given how far away she was, but it looked like blood was splattered all over her. Run! They're everywhere. Oh God, they're everywhere. A big bearded man in flip-flops barreled past the screaming girl, his face ghostly white and already glistening in sweat. His foot caught in one of his sandals, and he fell to the asphalt. The girl passed over him, still screaming. Another figure appeared behind the downed man. This figure had skin peeling from its cheek, and blood covered a shirtless torso. It fell upon the man, ripping into him. More screams erupted and people fled their vehicles, rushing toward the barricade. Shit, Scott muttered. Don't just stand there, guns ready, he yelled toward the small crowd of law enforcers closest to the attack. A man that Margaret recognized as the officer who first greeted her at the roadblock was the first to draw his firearm, though he did not fire right away. You should probably go find your granddaughter and get out of here, Scott said, shouldering his rifle. Margaret ignored the suggestion and pumped her double-barrel shotgun. She had a bet she knew why the zombies were here. She never found the zombie girl who seemed to control the undead horde. Margaret probably led her right to these people. All these deaths would be on her. Emma had her father near, and no matter how useless he was, he wouldn't let anything happen to Emma. Besides, Margaret was tired of running. It was time to show these zombies who's boss. Scott glanced over. I'm not going to lie. I'm happy to have you at my 6. Then he turned to his scope and started firing. He dropped the Zeke, devouring the flip-flopped man from earlier. Margaret had to be more careful. With the spread of her shotgun and the masses of screaming people, she didn't have a clear shot. More Zekes came sprinting toward the running crowds. There were dozens of them, all running faster than Margaret could fathom. They jumped on top of cars, stopping to pull people too afraid to leave out of their seats. An old man was one of these. Maybe he thought it was safer inside than to chance the running crowds, but he was wrong. The Zekes tore into him like dogs digging for a bone. Blood sprayed into the air all around them. Once the other police got a hold of their wits, they began firing. Margaret watched as one Zeke on top of a car hood took a blast to the chest. He spun in the air, before falling onto the street below. A little girl screamed in a parked Toyota, as her mother was pulled out of the car. The girl was maybe 5 years old, strapped into a booster seat. She didn't stand a chance if no one helped her. Her mother was already being bitten into. She screamed as blood poured down her shoulder, and more Zekes collided into her. Scott! Margaret screamed. She pointed toward the Toyota. I'm going to get her, cover me. He nodded and started picking off Zekes, making Margaret a path. She ran as fast as she could, which at her age wasn't fast at all, but the Toyota wasn't too far off. She ducked as a Zeke grabbed above her from the roof of a van. Blood exploded from the zombie's neck, and he dropped shortly after. Margaret looked back and nodded toward Scott. It looks like he could keep his promise to Margaret, after all. She was happy that her first impression of him had been incorrect. He was quite capable. The little girl's screams attracted a Zeke chasing after a teenage boy. He gave up his chase and turned toward the window right next to the little girl. It began slamming its fists into the glass pane. Hey! Margaret cried as she neared closer. The Zeke turned in time for his head to splatter like a watermelon as Margaret pulled the trigger. She cracked the barrel, allowing the spent casings to shoot out as she grabbed the door handle. She didn't have time to reload. She whispered a silent prayer for Scott's reaction time to be fast and his aim to be accurate. Margaret and this girl depended on it. Mommy! The little girl screamed, her little face scrunched up while tears and snot leaked out. Even though she was screaming Mommy over and over, she reached out toward Margaret once the door opened. Margaret fumbled with the clasps of the booster seat. She hadn't had to do this in so long. A hand grabbed her shoulder, and she turned to see the outstretched mouth of a Zeke. His teeth were black and chipped. His breath was the stench of death. Margaret screamed as she put her forearm into the zombie's throat, trying to keep him back. He scratched and pulled at her shirt, trying so hard to sink his teeth into her. With her free arm, Margaret reached for her shotgun, which was leaning against the side of the car. She hadn't had time to load it, but it still had uses. Her fingers wrapped around the barrel, but the Zeke overpowered her with only one arm holding him back. With all of her might, she pushed him back, giving her enough time to pull the shotgun up. The zombie stumbled backward, but was quick to lunge at her again. She greeted his charge with the stock of the gun, smacking it hard into the Zeke's teeth. A loud crack sounded, followed by little clicks all around her. She caught sight of a tooth hitting the ground. Then Margaret grabbed a hold of the gun with both hands like a baseball bat, and swung for the fences. The zombie's head caved with a wet crunch, and he dropped. 2 more Zekes rushed toward her, and Margaret readied her shotgun like a baseball player at home plate. She didn't need to swing, though. Both zombies dropped as chunks of flesh exploded around them. She looked back toward Scott, who offered a quick nod. Margaret undid the clasps, locking the little girl in place, and abandoned the gun so she could carry her. The little girl wasn't that big, but still Margaret struggled to hold her. Scott met Margaret halfway, his rifle still popping shots. Once Margaret passed him, he fell in behind her, keeping any sprinting Zekes from grabbing a hold of her or the girl. The cops formed a line and were keeping the Zekes in check. Most that hadn't already been feasting were taken down before reaching the main mass of people trying to get through the blockade. There are so many of them, Margaret thought. Even if Margaret was cut off from Emma, she was happy that Emma had been on the other side before the attack. Some of the cops from the other side began cutting into the fencing and peeling back the chain links. As soon as an opening was formed, people filled the gaps, scraping to get through. Margaret could not see a way out. The little girl still wept in her arms. She kissed the girl on the forehead. "We'll be all right," she whispered. "I will get you out of here." Scott fell in beside Margaret, no longer firing his rifle. "It's settling down," he said. "We're trapped, though. If more come, I don't know if we'll survive another wave of that." Margaret followed Scott's gaze and surveyed the damage. He was right. When Margaret first appeared at the roadblock, the sea of blue-suited officers were endless, but now there were maybe 24 officers still standing. Bodies, both living and undead, littered the pavement. "Nana." Margaret whipped around, her heart dropping into the pit of her stomach. As she feared, Emma stood behind her. "No, Emma. What are you doing over here? You were safe. Why? Why would you come back?" Chapter 11. Boss Fight. "Nana, it's okay. There's a way back a little further down. No one else seems to notice the gap." "There's a way to the car?" "Yes," Emma said with a smile. "I will not abandon you. We have to go now, though. Who knows how long it will go unnoticed." "Bless you, dear," Margaret said with a smile. "Officer Lombardi, did you hear that? Are you coming?" Scott did not answer. He seemed more focused on an officer dragging another man in a SWAT uniform just like Scott's. The man had been a victim of the attack. They had ripped his throat out, but the rest of him was untouched. "Mars, you dipshit," Scott muttered as he walked over to help the cop pulling the man's body. "He saved my life," the cop said. Even when those things tore his throat open, he kept firing. The man's eyes were glassy and distant. "Yeah, he was always playing the hero," Scott said. "Nana, we have to go," Emma whispered to Margaret. But Margaret did not want to leave Scott. The man had saved her life back there, and she knew that if he stayed here he would die. All of these brave men and women would. Fate must have read Margaret's thoughts, because a familiar hellish scream echoed throughout the valley. It was the little undead girl. Margaret knew she would be back. "The Banshee," Emma said, eyes wide. Margaret figured the word must be another nickname, identifying the different zombies. The name seemed fitting enough. "Emma, take her," Margaret said. Emma was quick to relieve Margaret of the little girl. She had stopped crying mostly, but she still sniffed at the snot dripping from her nose. She took to Emma easy enough. You take her with you through the gap you found, Margaret said. You're coming too, aren't you? No. I'm going to stay. Emma opened her mouth to protest. Margaret said, cutting her off. Don't argue, please just do as I ask. If we do not kill this thing, it will follow us all the way back to your mother's. Get your dad and head back. I'll join you once this zombie brat is taken care of. That was a long shot, Margaret knew. Emma paused, her face twisted in concern. She looked over the crowd of people before speaking. I'll find Dad, but we're not leaving without you. Emma, Margaret started. No, Nana. We'll have the Lincoln ready to go for when you get through. And if I don't get through? You will. Emma. Margaret started. She'll get through, Scott interrupted. He had the fallen officer's rifle in his hand. He outstretched it to Margaret. What do you say, Grandma? You still got some fight left in you? Margaret accepted the gun and nodded. Emma, if you see the barricade fall and I'm not back, leave without me. It's best you get out of here, Emma, Scott added. Your grandma needs her head in the game. Nana, be careful, she said, beginning to tear up. She wrapped an arm around Margaret's neck, while saddling the little girl on her hip like a natural mother. I love you. And we're not going anywhere without you. I love you too. Now go. Emma took a long look at Margaret and then ran off, following the fence toward the medical area. She'll be fine, Scott said. She comes from a line of tough chicks. Margaret was flabbergasted by being referred to as a chick. She was nearly 80 years old, but she appreciated the encouragement. The mag is already loaded and you're ready to fire, Scott said, pointing to Margaret's gun. You have 30 rounds. It's all we got, so make them count. If you see a little zombie girl, take her out first, Margaret said. I don't know what will happen if she's gone, but I'm betting the rest of them will be easier to take down. Scott nodded. All right, guys, you hear that? He shouted to nearby officers. You see a screaming dead girl, take her down. She's top priority. Hold the line and let's give those people enough time to get out. A few of them confirmed they understood, but others had their eyes on the fence still blocked by fleeing civilians. Margaret didn't think that Scott had the rank to lead, but he appeared to be the most held together in the chaos. Besides, rank didn't mean much. What was important was whether others will follow, and in that moment, the other officers seemed okay to let Scott lead. The little girl's screams grew louder, and Margaret shouldered her rifle, using the high-powered scope attached. She could see much farther. Part of her wished she couldn't, because she almost lost hope at what she saw. A line of what Emma referred to as brutes matched the line of officers guarding the barricade. There were maybe 20 of the goon-like creatures, all standing behind a sole brute which the little girl sat atop of. The line began to gallop toward them, pushing aside and flipping cars as they ran. The line of brutes fell into a V formation, with the little girl's steed in front. It was hard to see around the giant creatures, but Margaret thought she saw smaller Zeeks shambling behind them. The scene reminded Margaret of a medieval battle tactic, sending the armored knights on horseback through the enemy's defenses first and leave the ground troops to clean up behind them. She looked over at the other men and women in line with her. To their credit, they all had their guns up and ready. Most were shaking and unsteady, but they were still there. It made Margaret proud to be next to them, but she was also sad that all of these noble people would likely lose their lives. None of them stood a chance. The only reason she remained was to keep her granddaughter safe. Jesus Christ, Scott said next to her. What are those things? I wouldn't use his name in vain. We could use all the help we can get right now. Cars screeched and skidded off the road as the line of creatures grew closer. The smell of burning rubber and spilled gasoline filled the air. Spilled gasoline. Margaret's mind played with the thought. Gas. Margaret cried. That's it. What? Scott asked. Do you have anything that could start a fire? Scott quirked an eyebrow in confusion, but after a few seconds he seemed to gather her meaning. Flares, he yelled. Do any of you have any flares? The line of officers looked around at each other, confused by the question. A young Latina-looking officer leaned over, her black hair pulled back into a ponytail sticking out from under a blue hat. She was quite pretty. I have a few traffic flares, she said. Romero, right? Scott asked. Yeah. You may have just saved our lives. Throw 'em over. She broke formation, running over to hand Scott 3 red batons. It's all I have, she added before heading back. It'll have to do, Scott said. He let his rifle hang at his hip and handed 2 of the sticks to Margaret. Light these up, I'll throw. Aim for the overturned cars, Margaret added as she twisted off the cap of one flare. There's a greater possibility of gas. Scott twisted his own flare and it hissed to life. Shortly after, he let it fly. It landed a good distance away, but Margaret could still make out the bright light as it rolled toward an overturned truck. She held her breath, anticipating an explosion, but it never came. Shit, Scott said, grabbing another flare from Margaret. With the line of zombie beasts drawing closer to them, Scott did not time his next throw. It fell nowhere near a car. Instead, it fell harmlessly onto the road just shy of the front brute. All those years of baseball better have been for something, he muttered in frustration. This is the last one, Margaret reminded him as he grabbed the last flare. Their group would not last long if he missed. I know. He waited a little longer, though maybe only a second or two in total before tossing the last flare. It arced high and its path seemed true. It headed straight for an overturned car near the undead girl's brute. Just as it fell, the banshee girl jumped and caught the flare with its only remaining arm. It screamed in defiance. No fucking way, Scott yelled, grabbing at his rifle. Margaret already had hers aimed and ready. Please, she prayed. Guide my aim. She pulled the trigger. The banshee's head exploded while still crying out. Margaret's shot had connected. Thank you, God, she praised as the girl's body fell off her brute's shoulders. Her body smacked the road before being trampled by an adjacent brute who also kicked the live flare during its run. The flare rolled toward the flipped car. Margaret held her breath once more and dared to hope. A spark lit, and a trail of fire shot toward the car. An explosion boomed, taking one brute off its feet. A chain reaction of explosions followed, all going off at different times, but they were enough to take out a few of the brutes. The line of police officers cheered as more and more explosions sounded off like fireworks. Most of the line of brutes had broken. They were either torn apart or dead for good. Unfortunately, Margaret had been right about the Zeeks. Dozens had been running behind their larger brethren. It's not over, Margaret said. Now the fight really begins. Scott stopped his cheering and turned down the line of cops. We broke their line. Now show these bastards what happens to those who mess with the boys in blue. More cheers and gunfire erupted. Zeke started dropping. With only 29 more rounds, Margaret saved her ammo for the brutes. She still wasn't quite used to the rifle Scott had handed her, but it was definitely more efficient than the double-barreled shotgun. She fired at a brute stampeding away from the horde. He seemed more interested in going around the line of police officers than through them. It took 3 shots, but Margaret brought him down before he got too far. As predicted, the other zombies were less organized without the guiding hand of the banshee. Instead of filling in the gaps of missing undead in their charging line, they scattered about. The faster Zeeks pulled ahead of the few remaining brutes. Round after round unleashed from the line of officers, and undead bodies dropped to the pavement, finding their eternal rest with the help of bullets. I'm out. Someone screamed. Me too, another followed. Margaret knew she too was low, but she began picking off zombies based on their proximity rather than their size. She did what she could to help. 17, she muttered as an overweight Zeke in a white tank dropped mere feet away. A scream let out to Margaret's left. The man who had originally greeted her and Emma during the roadblock had been pulled to the ground. Two Zeeks had broken through and were biting into him, one at his thigh, the other into an arm he had thrown up in defense. Blood started pooling all around him as they overpowered the heavy-set man. The officer closest to him, one of the same cops who had called that they were out of ammo, swatted at the Zeeks with a club. He committed to each swing, but it wasn't enough to deter the zombies from their meal. The man's screams had drawn more of the undead. They swarmed to the location like hyenas to a fresh kill. The man with the club worked faster, and he managed to drop a newly arriving Zeke, but he was quickly taken down by another. Margaret unloaded in that direction, trying to thin out the herd and give the other officers a chance to retreat, but no matter how many she dropped, a new Zeke replaced the fallen. The creatures were in a frenzy. Without a guide, the Zeeks were reduced to mindless husks with only one purpose: to feed. "Romero, look out!" Scott called from beside Margaret. The center of the line had turned into a slaughter, and the female officer had thrown herself into the middle of it. She dropped her rifle to pull out another officer being fed on. She was too focused on helping her comrade to notice the Zeke rushing in from her right. It tackled her to the ground, ripping her away from the man she had been pulling. Her cries cut through the commotion as more undead piled onto her. "Romero!" Scott cried again, sprinting toward the massacre. Margaret did the best she could to cover him. She dropped two more Zeeks before the trigger announced her empty. Scott fought like a madman, pulling zombies off of Romero. He too must have run out of ammo, because he resorted to smashing in skulls with the stock of his rifle. Blood sprayed in the air and collected on his face and arms. He looked like the harbinger of death. No matter how many he brought down, it wasn't enough. They just kept coming. Margaret watched in horror as more and more officers went down. Screams and wet gnashing teeth rang out all around her. She turned toward the fences and was saddened to see a crowd waiting to get through. The mass of people lessened, but still there were so many. With no ammunition and no escape, they were all doomed. She had been content with the thought of death before, but now that death was so close, she found herself wanting to live. Or maybe she did not want to die this way, she considered, as a Zeke bit into a fist of intestines like a toddler eating spaghetti for the first time. "Officer Lombardi!" Margaret cried, over the massacre. "We have to go. We're dead if we stay." No answer came back. The slaughter continued with screams echoing all around. She could not see him through the thick cloud of undead. "Scott!" She yelled again. A hand grabbed the back of her arm, and she instinctively turned with her rifle raised to bash in the face of whatever grabbed her. Luckily, she was able to stop herself before any damage could be done. Scott stood beside her, covered in gore with a grim look on his face. "I couldn't save them," he said. "You bought them some time," she said, pointing toward the thinned crowd of civilians. "Every second you fought was another second of breath for them. But we have to go now. It's hopeless." Scott beat another zombie down before it could grab hold of them. "You were right," he finally said after beating the undead corpse more than needed. "This is the stuff of nightmares." The odd pair ran toward the barricade, taking down any chasing Zeeks that they could. Most of the zombies had stayed back, feasting on what remained of the defending police force. "You need to run," Margaret warned as they reached the fence. "They're coming." She knew it would panic those in the back who heard her, but they had a right to know. They needed to get out of there. The crowd's best chance was a thin crew of officers behind the barricade. A few had what appeared to be sniper rifles, and they were firing into the undead army, but it wouldn't be enough. The people needed to scatter. When the end comes, it comes fast. "This way," Margaret said to Scott. Instead of risking her way through the panicked crowd, she followed along the fence in the direction she had seen Emma run. There was an opening somewhere, and she was going to find it. Sure enough, they came upon an area that wasn't quite finished. The chain link hung loose and curled next to a post. Margaret and Scott squeezed through and continued toward the medical area. They had moved most of the ambulances, and only a few people remained in the area, but Margaret's Lincoln still sat in the same place she had parked. Emma was already in the driver's seat, waving at them to hurry. Margaret hopped into the passenger seat, and the little girl she had rescued hopped onto her lap. Scott jumped into the back seat next to a passed-out Nathan. The blood had been cleaned from his face, and he was cradled against the window, eyes closed. "What happened to your father?" Margaret asked. Emma looked back and shrugged. "He wouldn't calm down, so they sedated him. I think they used a little too much. I had to get help just to get him in the car." "What happened back there?" Emma looked back and forth between Margaret and Scott. Scott shook his head and wouldn't meet her eyes. "The Banshee is gone," Margaret said. "That's what's important." That was all Emma needed. She put the car into reverse, and the car jolted under her inexperience. "I think I should probably drive," Margaret said. "Nope, I got this," Emma added. "I have plenty of practice. Besides, you two look like you need some rest." Her eyes flicked up to the mirror, locking onto Scott. Margaret didn't argue. Her body was a complete wreck, her back and shoulders ached, she had a migraine, and she was finding it hard to remain strong after the day's events. Rest was welcome. And although she closed her eyes, that rest never came. Instead, images of the dead ripping into the living played over and over in her mind. Chapter 12. Safe at last. Emma rushed through the front door with Margaret and the little girl close behind, while Scott helped Nathan out of the car. The home was fortunately outside of city limits, so Margaret figured that her daughter was fine, but still she worried. The day had not been kind to her. "Mom," Emma called. "Patricia." Margaret joined in. They walked through the foyer and toward the kitchen. The home appeared empty. The TV was not on, and there were no sounds throughout the house. It appeared no one was home. Margaret felt her heart tighten as Emma went down the hall, continuing her calls for Patricia. What if Patricia had left? What if she left to find Emma and was caught in the roadblock? Oh God, please no. She couldn't bear it if she had abandoned her daughter to those undead monsters. Footfalls sounded on the stairs leading up from the basement. Margaret ran to the banister to see a sweating Patricia in workout attire with white headphones in her ears. Patricia was alive. Margaret felt herself beginning to cry as she rounded the stairs. "Oh my God, Mom?" Patricia asked with shock painted on her face. "What are you doing here? What's wrong?" Margaret didn't answer. She couldn't if she wanted to. She could feel herself choking on emotion. Today had so many losses, but not this. This was a win. Instead, she latched onto her daughter, letting the tears flow. Emma came running from the hallway. She joined in, wrapping around both Margaret and Patricia. "You're okay," she said with a smile. "Of course I'm okay. What is going on?" Margaret heard Scott and Nathan shuffle through the door. Nathan was mumbling something incoherent, and Scott was cursing under his breath, obviously not thrilled about being left to handle the bastard son-in-law. "Nathan. Jesus, what happened to him?" Patricia asked. Margaret loosened her grip and looked into her daughter's face. A laugh escaped her lips at the memory of her son-in-law losing it. She knew it was crazy, but she couldn't help but find any ill will that came his way entertaining. "Dad's fine, Mom," Emma said. "Have you not been out today?" "No," Patricia said, confused. "But I was about to head out after a shower. Will someone please tell me what's going on?" The little girl Margaret had saved made her way to Margaret's leg. She latched on tight, staring up at Patricia. "Mom," Patricia said under her breath. "Who is that?" "This is, Margaret started. She hadn't realized in the commotion, but she had never asked the girl her name. She had been so concerned about getting out alive and keeping the girl calm, that her name had slipped through. "Well, I guess I don't know." "Dear, what's your name?" The little girl shied away and hid her face behind Margaret while white-knuckling her pant leg. "It's okay," Emma said. "We're here to help you." "My name is Emma, that's Margaret, but I call her Nana, and this is my mom, Patricia." "What's your name?" "My mom died," the little girl said sheepishly. Margaret heard Patricia gasp. "Your mother was very brave. She was trying to keep you safe. Can you be brave too? Can you tell us your name?" "Addison." "Addison," Margaret repeated. "That's a very beautiful name. Well, Addison, you're safe with us." The little girl buried her face again. "You hungry?" Emma asked. "We have mac and cheese. It's organic, but I know how to make it taste like the good stuff. Do you want to know the secret to it?" Addison shook her head up and down, making her sandy curls bob. Emma smiled, and Margaret matched the smile at seeing her granddaughter do so well with the little one. "Well, follow me. I might need your help to get it started." The little girl stepped from behind Margaret and grabbed a hold of Emma's hand as they headed toward the kitchen. "This will be fun. I'll let you in on part of the secret now, but you have to promise you'll still try it when it's done." "I promise." "You add a little bit of mustard," Emma said. "Ew," Addison droned. The rest of the conversation broke off as they made it deeper into the kitchen. "Mom," Patricia asked, "please, tell me what in the hell is going on." Margaret's smile faded as she turned away from the kitchen. It was time for her to relive the day again, and she was not looking forward to it. "I will, but first sit. This will take some time to get through." Emma placed a neatly folded letter on the kitchen island. Moonlight bled in from the window, landing perfectly on the name penned on the outside. Nana. She addressed the letter to her grandmother, figuring that it would be overlooked if she had written Mom or Dad on it. They tended to be less attentive than Nana. The letter explained why she was leaving and promised that she would return. She also begged that no one try to find her before she returned. She hoped they listened to her, but she couldn't see Nana taking the request to stay put. That is why she had to leave now. She needed the head start, and perhaps she would get lucky and find Danny before anyone even knew she was gone. Her heart ached at the thought of seeing him again. She was so worried about him. She set a green drawstring backpack onto a stool next to the island and then checked the cabinets. She grabbed a few granola bars, a bag of her favorite baked chips, and few bottles of water. She looked at the meager set of supplies and hoped that she wouldn't regret not packing more, but she couldn't bring herself to take any more. If she packed more, that meant she believed that she would not be coming back anytime soon. Her mind drifted to the possibility of running into Zeke's and Brute's. She considered borrowing a gun from Nana or Scott, but decided it was pointless since she didn't know how to use one anyway. The baseball bat she found in the garage would have to do. She shouldered the small bag, and though lightly packed, the straps still dug into her exposed armpits. She wore a loose tank that flowed freely at the belly, shorts and high-top sneakers. They were the closest thing she had to running shoes, and there was a possibility she would do a lot of that soon. Emma also still wore her crochet arm guards, but those had no purpose for what she was about to do, they just looked cool. Reaching the front door, Emma paused with her hand on the doorknob. She turned back, scanning the dark reaches of her home. Right now her mother, father, Nana, Scott, and little Addison were all sleeping. Hopefully dreaming well, though Emma doubted it. They all had a very difficult day. She could not help but think if she was doing the right thing by leaving them. Was she crazy for leaving the safety of her home and abandoning her family to go find Danny? She was scared, she knew that much, and as if to confirm the thought, images of the undead flashed into her mind's eye again. The wet sucking of flesh and blood dripping down their decayed faces would haunt her forever. But she could not deny the urgency she felt in the pit of her stomach. She needed to find Danny. Her heart told her she was doing the right thing. Who cared if she and Danny had only been dating a couple of months? She knew he was the one. Forget a couple of months, she realized she loved him in a couple of days. She hadn't told him that yet, but she planned to once she found him. "I'm coming, Danny," she whispered into the darkness. "We'll be together soon." Emma took a deep breath and silently slipped into the night air. To be continued. Author's note. Thanks for reading Shotgun Grandma Volume 1. If you enjoyed this book, please consider leaving an honest review. It can be difficult for indie books to gain attention, so reviews go a long way. Thanks for the support. Come visit me at www.evangrantauthor.com.